Did you know that some historians still debate whether the earliest Slavic tribes, those ancient peoples whose whispers might still echo in the sprawling forests of modern Russia, truly migrated from beyond the Carpathian Mountains, or if they had been quietly tending their fields along the great rivers for millennia? It's a fascinating thought, isn't it, to consider that the very ground beneath your feet, metaphorically speaking, holds secrets about where the story of a vast empire truly began. Imagine, if you will, the mists of time, parting just enough to reveal scattered settlements, small independent communities bound by loose tribal ties, speaking similar dialects, and worshipping a pantheon of nature deities. Perun, the thunder god, perhaps Veles, the god of the underworld, and cattle, keeping watch over their simple lives. These were the proto-Russians, if we can even call them that, living in an age before grand capitals and sprawling empires, an age of subsistence farming, of hunting in vast untamed woodlands, and of defending their homes from various nomadic groups sweeping in from the steppes. We are talking about a time when the concept of Russia was as alien as a smartphone in the hands of a medieval monk. Yet it's in these nebulous beginnings that the very fabric of a future superpower was spun, thread by unassuming thread. The land itself, immense and often unforgiving, played a silent but profound role, shaping the character of its inhabitants, fostering a certain resilience, a connection to the cycles of nature that would persist for centuries. The dense forests offered protection, while the great rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Neva, would later become vital arteries of commerce and conquest. Now picture another group, a different kind of wanderer, emerging from the cold northern seas. These were the Varangians, Viking warriors and traders, with their distinctive longships cutting through the water like sharpened knives. They weren't coming to conquer in the traditional sense, not at first anyway, but rather to trade, to establish lucrative routes that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, connecting Scandinavia with the glittering markets of Byzantium. It's here in this collision of cultures that things start to get truly interesting, a kind of historical mashup that modern-day reality TV producers would kill for. These Norsemen, known to the Slavs as Rus, began to integrate, not always peacefully, into the existing tribal structures. They were, in essence, the entrepreneurial disruptors of their day, offering protection, demanding tribute, and introducing new forms of organization. We might even joke that they were the original consultants, arriving, assessing the situation, and then, shall we say, optimizing the local governance for a fee. The legend, or perhaps the cleverly crafted origin story, suggests that the Slavic tribes, weary of internal strife, actually invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to rule over them. "Our land is great and abundant, but there is no order among us," they supposedly declared, a plea that sounds eerily similar to certain modern-day political laments, doesn't it? Whether this invitation was genuine or simply a narrative constructed later to legitimize foreign rule is, of course, one of those delightful historical ambiguities that keep scholars up at night. But regardless of its precise truth, the arrival of Rurik and his kin marked a crucial turning point. His successors, particularly Oleg, began to consolidate power, moving south from Novgorod, a nascent trading hub, towards the strategic prize of Kiev on the Dnieper River. This was a time of dynamic flux, where the boundaries between native and foreigner were fluid, often blurring through intermarriage and cultural exchange. The Varangians, though initially distinct, gradually adopted the language and customs of the Slavs, becoming less Norse and more, well, Russian. It's almost as if they underwent a slow, organic rebranding process, transforming from Viking raiders into Slavic princes. Imagine a group of rugged, axe-wielding warriors slowly trading their horned helmets for fur hats and their sagas for Slavic folktales. Quite the transition, wouldn't you say? The establishment of trade routes, particularly the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, which snaked its way down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and Constantinople, brought immense wealth and influence to these early principalities. It wasn't just goods that flowed along these paths. Ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs traveled too, shaping the nascent identity of this emerging state. This period was not without its brutal moments, of course. Conquest was often violent, and power was held through strength and strategic alliances. But it was also a period of remarkable genesis, laying the groundwork for something far grander than anyone at the time could have possibly imagined. The stage was being set, quite literally, for an empire that would span continents and endure for centuries. A story that truly begins in the muddy, fertile lands of Eastern Europe, long before anyone had even conceived of a Tsar or a Kremlin. So from those scattered settlements and the ambitious arrival of the Varangians, we arrive at the pivotal moment, the true birth of Kievan Rus, a state that would become the historical wellspring for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. It's here that the story of a unified, albeit loosely structured entity really takes hold, moving beyond mere tribal groupings into something resembling a kingdom. Oleg, Rurik's successor, a chieftain with a keen eye for strategic real estate, famously seized Kiev around 882 CE, declaring it the mother of Rus's cities. Imagine the audacity, the sheer confidence of this move. He essentially established the capital of this nascent realm in a location that offered unparalleled access to the Dnieper River, that crucial trade artery connecting the Baltic with the Byzantine Empire. It was like buying up all the prime beachfront property before anyone else even knew there was a beach. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a foundational act, establishing a political and economic center that would dominate the region for centuries. The early princes of Kiev, men of both Norse and Slavic lineage, were less benevolent rulers and more, shall we say, protection racketeers on a grand scale. They'd lead annual poliuri, or roundups, traveling through their territories to collect tribute from the subjugated tribes, a practice that combined elements of tax collection with a good old-fashioned show of force. Think of it as the original mobile tax service, only with more armed guards and significantly less paperwork. The true watershed moment for Kievan Rus, however, arrived with Prince Vladimir the Great in the late 10th century. Now, Vladimir, he was a character, a man who, if he were alive today, would undoubtedly be the subject of a wildly popular, slightly scandalous historical drama. He started his reign as a pagan, quite the enthusiast for traditional Slavic deities, even establishing a pantheon of idols in Kiev. But as often happens with ambitious rulers seeking to consolidate power and elevate their state on the international stage, Vladimir began to explore monotheistic religions. He supposedly sent envoys to study Islam, Judaism, Catholicism, and Orthodox Christianity. The tales surrounding this conversion are wonderfully dramatic, almost too perfect, involving beautiful churches and compelling arguments. The account of his envoy's visit to Constantinople, describing the awe-inspiring beauty of the Hagia Sophia and the grandeur of the Orthodox liturgy, is particularly vivid. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men. Whether those were their exact words, the sentiment certainly resonated. In 98 CE, in a move that dramatically altered the course of Eastern European history, Vladimir officially adopted Orthodox Christianity as the state religion, a decision that cemented Kievan Rus's spiritual and cultural ties to the Byzantine Empire rather than to the Latin West. This wasn't just a religious shift, it was a geopolitical masterstroke, linking the emerging Rus's state to a powerful, sophisticated empire and providing a unifying ideology for a diverse collection of peoples. It was like upgrading from a local dial-up internet connection to a high-speed fiber optic link to the greatest cultural and political hub of its time. The adoption of Christianity brought with it a cascade of changes. Literacy increased with the introduction of the Cyrillic alphabet, allowing for the translation of religious texts and the development of a native written culture. Churches, magnificent examples of Byzantine architecture, began to dot the landscape, transforming the visual and spiritual identity of the cities. Monasteries became centers of learning and artistic production, preserving knowledge and fostering a unique Rus's artistic tradition. The legal system also began to evolve, influenced by Byzantine law, though traditional Slavic customs certainly persisted. Kievan Rus reached its zenith under Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century. He was a builder, a legislator, and a diplomat who strategically married his children into the royal houses of Europe, securing alliances and enhancing the prestige of his realm. Historians still argue whether his famous legal code, the Russkaya Pravda, was truly a cohesive, innovative legal framework, or simply a compilation of existing customary laws. Regardless, it provided a degree of legal order and helped to standardize justice across the various principalities. This era was a golden age, characterized by economic prosperity, flourishing arts, and a burgeoning sense of collective identity. Kiev, with its golden dome churches and bustling markets, became one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Europe, a rival to Constantinople itself. Imagine the vibrant street life, the scent of spices from the east mingling with the aroma of pine from the northern forests, the babble of different languages in the marketplaces, a true melting pot of cultures and commerce. However, beneath this veneer of prosperity and unity, cracks were beginning to show. The system of succession, known as rota system or ladder succession, where power typically passed not directly from father to eldest son, but to the eldest surviving member of the ruling Rurik clan, often led to intense internecine strife. This meant that princes would frequently move from one principality to another, vying for the most prestigious and lucrative positions, especially Kiev. It was a bit like a game of musical chairs, but with entire cities and armies at stake, and the loser often ended up, well, headless. This constant shifting of power, combined with the increasing autonomy of regional principalities and the decline of the vital trade routes due to new threats and political realignments, slowly but surely eroded the centralized authority of Kiev. The vastness of the territory, without truly effective administrative control from the center, also contributed to fragmentation. External threats, particularly from nomadic Turkic tribes like the Pechenegs and the Polovtsi, also put a strain on resources and manpower, forcing princes to focus on local defense rather than unified expansion. So, by the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Kievan Rus was less a unified state and more a collection of powerful, often warring principalities, each with its own ambitious ruler, its own distinct interests. The Golden Age was fading, and the stage was being set for a cataclysmic event that would redefine the future of Russia and its neighbors for centuries to come. And so, as Kievan Rus fractured into a patchwork of squabbling principalities, a storm was brewing on the distant steppes, a storm of unprecedented ferocity that would sweep across Eurasia and fundamentally reshape its destiny. Imagine, if you will, the whispers of fear that began to travel westward, carried by terrified refugees and desperate merchants. Tales of horsemen, countless as locusts, riding under a banner adorned with a nine-tailed yak's hair standard. These were the Mongols, a unified, disciplined, and utterly ruthless force forged by the legendary Genghis Khan. Their arrival wasn't a gradual infiltration. It was an explosive, devastating onslaught, an entirely different kind of invader than the relatively localized squabbles the Rus' princes were accustomed to. It's like going from dealing with a neighborhood spat to facing down an alien invasion force. The scale and nature of the threat were simply incomparable. The speed of their advance was terrifying, their tactics brilliant and brutal, often involving feigned retreats, overwhelming numerical superiority, and a willingness to commit unimaginable atrocities to break the will of their enemies. The initial major encounter for the Rus' princes came in 1223 CE at the Battle of the Kalka River. Here, a combined force of Rus' princes and their Cuman allies, who were nomadic neighbors, bravely but foolishly confronted a Mongol reconnaissance force. Despite initial successes, the disunity among the Rus' princes, a recurring theme, led to their utter defeat. Historians still argue whether this battle was primarily a result of Mongol military genius or the catastrophic lack of coordination among the Rus' forces, who seemed more interested in outmaneuvering each other than in presenting a united front. The Mongols, after their victory, then inexplicably retreated, leaving the Rus to ponder this terrifying new threat, a pause that was merely the calm before the truly apocalyptic storm. This initial encounter was a chilling preview of what was to come, a stark demonstration of the Mongols' military prowess and the Rus' fatal disunity. It was a warning shot, but one largely ignored, or perhaps simply misunderstood, by the fragmented principalities, each too consumed by its own petty rivalries to grasp the existential danger lurking on the horizon. Then, in the late 1230s, the full force of the Mongol invasion, led by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, descended upon the lands of Ruses. City after city fell in a terrifying sequence: Ryazan, Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, and eventually, in 1240 CE, Kiev itself. The destruction was comprehensive and horrific. Accounts from the time describe cities razed to the ground, populations slaughtered or enslaved, and entire regions depopulated. Imagine the vibrant, golden-domed Kiev we spoke of earlier, reduced to ashes and rubble. Its magnificent churches defiled, its streets silent save for the wind whistling through burnt timbers. It was an event of such catastrophic proportions that it effectively ended the Kievan period of Russia's history, shattering its political and cultural dominance. The Mongols didn't stay to directly administer these conquered lands in the same way they did in some other parts of their vast empire. Instead, they established a system of indirect rule known as the Mongol Yoke, or the Tatar Yoke, as the Ruses often referred to their overlords, the Golden Horde, a Mongol successor state. This involved setting up their capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga River, and demanding regular heavy tribute from the Ruses' princes. Every Ruses' prince had to travel to Sarai to receive a yalik, or charter, confirming their right to rule from the Khan. This wasn't just a formal submission. It was a deeply humiliating act, forcing the proud descendants of Rurik to grovel before a foreign potentate. A powerful psychological blow that lingered for centuries. It's almost as if they were forced to regularly renew their license to rule from an incredibly stern, distant, and often capricious overlord. The impact of the Mongol yoke on Ruses was profound and multifaceted, casting a long shadow over the subsequent centuries. Firstly, it undeniably contributed to the fragmentation of the Ruses' lands. While the Mongols did destroy the central authority of Kiev, they also inadvertently allowed for the rise of new regional centers of power, particularly in the northern and northeastern lands, away from the direct invasion routes, which would eventually coalesce into the nucleus of the future Russian state. Secondly, the constant burden of tribute, often collected with ruthless efficiency by Mongol tax collectors or by collaborationist Russia's princes, drained the economic resources of the principalities, hindering their development and perpetuating a cycle of poverty. Thirdly, the Mongol invasion, particularly the sheer scale of the devastation, led to a significant demographic shift, with populations fleeing northward into the forests, creating new settlements and further decentralizing the population. This also influenced the development of distinct regional identities that would eventually evolve into the separate nationalities of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Furthermore, the Mongol yoke is often cited as a key factor in the divergence of Muscovy and later Russia from Western Europe. While Western Europe was experiencing the Renaissance and the early stirrings of scientific inquiry, Ruses was isolated, forced to look eastward towards its Mongol overlords, rather than westward for inspiration or trade. This isolation fostered a unique political culture, one that emphasized strong, centralized, and autocratic rule, as the Russia's princes learned that a degree of unity and absolute power was necessary for survival and for effectively dealing with their powerful overlords. The Mongols, for their part, did not impose their religion on the Rus, largely allowing them to maintain their Orthodox Christian faith, which remained a crucial source of cultural continuity and identity during this period of foreign domination. However, the influence of their administrative techniques, their emphasis on a strong military, and even certain aspects of their vocabulary and postal system, the yam system, can be detected in later Russian governance. It was a dark period, undoubtedly, but it was also a crucible in which the future Russian state began to slowly, painstakingly forge its own distinct character, often under conditions of extreme duress. The very experience of subjugation, paradoxically, strengthened the resolve of certain principalities and set the stage for a new power to emerge from the ashes of Kievan Rus. From the ashes of Kievan Rus, a new power began its slow, determined ascent, not from the traditional heartland, but from the comparatively obscure and forested northern territories, the Grand Principality of Muscovy. Imagine a small, initially unassuming settlement nestled in a strategic location at the confluence of several rivers, a place that, frankly, didn't seem destined for greatness. Yet through a combination of geographical advantage, astute political maneuvering, and a good deal of what can only be described as historical luck, Moscow began to consolidate power amidst the chaos of the Mongol Yoke. This wasn't an overnight phenomenon. It was a patient, almost glacial expansion, much like a tiny snowball rolling down a hill, slowly gathering mass and momentum. While other principalities were repeatedly devastated by Mongol raids or squabbled among themselves, Muscovy developed a shrewd, often pragmatic approach to its powerful overlords, the Golden Horde. The princes of Moscow, starting with figures like Daniel Alexandrovich, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, understood a crucial truth. Direct confrontation with the Mongols was suicidal. Instead, they adopted a policy of calculated submission, demonstrating loyalty, offering lavish tribute, and even, at times, acting as tax collectors for the Khan. This strategy, while deeply unpopular with some of their fellow Rus' princes, allowed Moscow to gain the Mongols' favor, earning them yarliks, those coveted charters of authority that granted them significant advantages over their rivals. It was a bit like being the teacher's pet, but on a geopolitical scale, where the teacher could flatten your entire city with a flick of their wrist. This favored status meant that Moscow often received fewer direct raids and was able to accumulate resources and manpower while other principalities languished. Historians still argue whether this collaboration was a cynical betrayal of Rus's interests or a necessary, pragmatic choice for survival. But one thing is certain: it worked. Moscow's geographical location also played a vital role in its rise. Situated in the heart of the Oka and Volga river basins, it was relatively protected from the Mongol raids that tended to sweep across the open southern steppes. The dense forests surrounding Moscow provided a natural defensive barrier and a place for refuge. Furthermore, its central position made it a hub for vital trade routes, attracting merchants and settlers, which in turn boosted its population and wealth. It was like building a thriving city in a natural fortress, allowing it to grow while others withered. Beyond geography and pragmatic collaboration, the princes of Moscow also demonstrated remarkable political acumen. They were adept at acquiring new territories, not just through conquest, but also through purchase, inheritance, and strategic marriages. They slowly bought up fragmented lands, bit by bit, assembling a growing domain like a meticulous collector, adding pieces to a priceless, ever-expanding puzzle. They also cleverly exploited the rivalries between other Rus' principalities, playing them against each other, further weakening potential competitors. Perhaps one of the most significant factors in Moscow's ascent was its alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church. After the fall of Kiev, the metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church, the highest ecclesiastical authority, eventually relocated his seat to Moscow in the early 14th century, bestowing immense spiritual legitimacy upon the principality. This was a monumental shift, transforming Moscow from merely a political center into the spiritual heart of the fragmented Rus' lands. It wasn't just a physical move, it was a symbolic coronation. The church, with its vast moral authority and extensive landholdings, provided invaluable support to the Muscovite princes, legitimizing their rule and promoting the idea of Moscow as the successor to Kiev, the new Third Rome after the fall of Constantinople. This spiritual endorsement resonated deeply with the populace, fostering a sense of shared identity and purpose under Muscovite leadership. The cumulative effect of these factors was a gradual but undeniable shift in power towards Moscow. While other princes struggled to maintain their independence or simply survive, the Muscovite rulers, generation after generation, steadily expanded their domains, consolidating their control and building a more centralized administration. The reign of Ivan Tobacco in Kalita, Ivan Moneybags in the early 14th century, is a prime example. He was particularly skilled at accumulating wealth and using it to buy land, bribe Mongol officials, and lend money to other princes, effectively bringing them under his financial and thus political sway. He understood that sometimes a well-placed loan could be more powerful than 1,000 swords. This period of slow consolidation, however, was not without its moments of defiance. While Moscow largely practiced submission, other princes occasionally rallied against the Mongol Yoke. The most famous instance was the Battle of Kulikovo Field in 1380, where Dmitry Donskoy, the Prince of Moscow, led a combined Rus' army to a significant victory against a segment of the Golden Horde. Though this victory did not immediately end Mongol rule, it was a symbolic watershed moment, demonstrating that the Mongols were not invincible and planting the seeds of hope for eventual liberation. It was a powerful psychological victory, a moment of collective pride after centuries of humiliation, much like a team finally beating a seemingly unbeatable opponent. This battle, in particular, cemented Moscow's role as the natural leader of the Rus' resistance and further enhanced its prestige among the other principalities. The stage was now set for the final decisive act of liberation, led by a prince who would solidify Moscow's dominance and lay the undisputed foundation for the future Russian state. So, with Moscow's star steadily rising, we arrive at the reign of Ivan III, famously known as Ivan the Great, a ruler who, much like a meticulous grandmaster in a chess match, systematically consolidated power and, crucially, cast off the oppressive Mongol Yoke. He inherited a principality that was already strong, but he possessed the strategic vision and unwavering determination to transform it into the undisputed center of a burgeoning Russian state. Imagine him, a figure of quiet authority, not given to impulsive outbursts, but rather to calculated moves that invariably expanded his domain. His reign, spanning from 1462 to 1505, was a period of relentless territorial acquisition, a time when the map of northeastern Russes began to truly coalesce under a single ruler. It's almost as if he had a mental checklist of independent principalities, and he just went about ticking them off one by one. Ivan's methods for absorbing other principalities were varied and remarkably effective. He employed a blend of military force, shrewd diplomacy, strategic marriages, and sometimes simply the overwhelming threat of his superior power. The most significant of these acquisitions was the annexation of Novgorod the Great in 1478. Novgorod, remember that ancient trading hub from our early discussions, was a powerful, wealthy city-state with a long tradition of republican governance, a kind of medieval Venice of the North, fiercely independent and proud. Its vibrant trade networks and democratic leanings made it a rival to Moscow's burgeoning autocracy. Ivan didn't just conquer it. He systematically dismantled its symbols of independence, famously removing the ancient Vech bell, the symbol of Novgorod's popular assembly, and sending it to Moscow. This was a powerfully symbolic act, akin to a victorious general seizing an enemy's flag and parading it through his own capital, declaring, "This is mine now." He then deported many of the leading Novgorodian families, replacing them with Muscovite loyalists, effectively neutralizing any lingering resistance and integrating the vast Novgorodian lands into his domain. This wasn't merely conquest. It was a comprehensive subjugation aimed at erasing a distinct political identity and forging a singular Moscow-centric state. But the defining achievement of Ivan the Great's reign, the one that truly liberated Russia and cemented his legacy, was the final overthrow of the Mongol Yoke. For centuries, the Rus's princes had paid tribute and submitted to the authority of the Golden Horde. By Ivan's time, however, the Golden Horde itself was weakening, fracturing into smaller rival khanates. Ivan, ever the opportunist, sensed this vulnerability. The symbolic culmination of this liberation came in 1480 with the Great Stand on the Ugra River. Picture this: Ivan's forces and the army of Akhmat Khan of the Golden Horde faced each other across the Ugra River for months, neither side willing to initiate a full-scale battle. It was a standoff, a tense, nerve-wracking waiting game, a bit like a prolonged staring contest between two heavily armed giants. The autumn chill set in, supplies dwindled, and eventually Akhmat Khan's forces, demoralized and facing a united Russian front, simply turned back and retreated without a fight. This bloodless victory was, in its own way, more profound than a bloody battle, for it marked the undisputed end of Mongol overlordship. Historians still argue whether the Mongols simply decided it wasn't worth the fight, or if Ivan's forces were genuinely superior. But the result was clear. Russia was finally free. It was a moment of immense national relief and pride, a historical mic drop that echoed across the land. With the Mongol threat lifted, Ivan the Great further solidified Moscow's position as the sole inheritor of Kievan Rus's legacy and the natural leader of Orthodox Christianity. Following the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Moscow began to promote itself as the Third Rome, the last bastion of true orthodoxy and the rightful successor to the Roman and Byzantine empires. This concept provided a powerful ideological justification for Moscow's expanding power and cemented its unique place in the Christian world. It was a grand narrative, a sweeping historical claim that elevated Moscow's status far beyond a mere regional principality. To reflect this new imperial ambition, Ivan introduced the double-headed eagle as the state emblem, borrowed from the Byzantine Empire, a powerful visual symbol that we still associate with Russia today. He also commissioned the construction of magnificent new buildings within the Moscow Kremlin, inviting Italian architects to create grand cathedrals and palaces, transforming the former wooden fortress into a formidable stone citadel worthy of a rising empire. Imagine the awe of foreign ambassadors arriving in Moscow, witnessing this transformation, seeing a city that was rapidly shedding its provincial past and embracing a new imperial grandeur. The Assumption Cathedral, built by the Italian architect Aristotle Fioravanti, still stands today as a testament to this period of architectural ambition and cultural exchange, a fusion of Russian Orthodox tradition with Renaissance flourishes. Ivan the Great's reign wasn't just about territorial expansion and liberation. It was also about establishing the foundations of the autocratic system that would define Russian rule for centuries. He centralized administration, created a unified legal code known as the Sudebnik of 1497, and strengthened the service nobility, who were granted land in exchange for military and state service. This move, a crucial step towards the eventual system of serfdom, tied the landowning class more closely to the state, creating a powerful, loyal elite. He was, in essence, building the bureaucratic machinery that would allow for the effective governance of a vast and growing empire. His successors would build upon these foundations, sometimes with terrifying results. But it was Ivan the Great who truly laid the brickwork of the modern Russian state, charting a course towards imperial ambition and centralized autocratic power. He left behind a realm transformed, no longer a collection of struggling principalities under a foreign yoke, but a nascent empire, ready to assert itself on the global stage. From the calculated grandeur of Ivan the Great, we now plunge into the tumultuous and often terrifying reign of his grandson Ivan the IV, forever etched into history as Ivan the Terrible. If Ivan the Great was a chess master, Ivan the Terrible was a force of nature, unpredictable and destructive, whose rule shaped Russia through a blend of remarkable centralization and horrifying cruelty. Imagine a ruler who could, in one moment, preside over sweeping reforms and in the next, descend into a paroxysm of paranoia and violence, executing loyal servants, and even, tragically, his own son. It's a Jekyll and Hyde scenario playing out on the grand stage of an emerging empire. A ruler whose very name strikes fear and fascination in equal measure. He became the first Russian ruler to formally adopt the title of Tsar, Caesar, in 1547, a deliberate and powerful symbolic act that asserted his supreme, almost divine authority, claiming a lineage not just from the Rurik princes, but directly from the Roman emperors. This wasn't just a change in title. It was a profound declaration of absolute power, a deliberate break from the past, marking the official birth of the Russian Tsardom. Ivan's early years, paradoxically, hinted at a more promising future. Crowned Tsar at a young age, his minority was marked by the destructive infighting of boyar noble factions, an experience that likely fueled his deep-seated distrust of the aristocracy. However, once he asserted personal rule, he embarked on a series of significant reforms that significantly strengthened the centralized state. He convened the Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, a proto-parliamentary body that included representatives from various social classes to advise on important state matters, though its power was always subordinate to the Tsar's will. He reformed the legal code, issuing a new Sudebnik in 1550, which aimed to standardize justice and reduce corruption. He also reformed the military, creating the Streltsy, a standing army equipped with firearms, a crucial step in modernizing Russia's armed forces. He even introduced local self-government in some regions, attempting to curb the power of corrupt local officials. These early reforms were genuinely progressive, laying the groundwork for a more efficient and centralized administration. It's almost as if he started off with a grand vision for a well-ordered state, a kind of meticulous architect. However, around the mid-1560s, a dramatic and terrifying shift occurred in Ivan's personality and rule, often attributed to the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, and a severe illness that he barely survived, which he suspected was a result of poisoning by the boyars. His inherent paranoia, simmering beneath the surface, erupted into a full-blown reign of terror, known as the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan abruptly left Moscow, threatening to abdicate, but then agreed to return on the condition that he be granted absolute power to punish traitors and create a special personal domain known as the Oprichnina, from the word oprich, meaning apart or separate. This was a state within a state, ruled directly by Ivan and enforced by his infamous Oprichniki, a black-clad, dog-headed, broom-wielding personal guard who rode on black horses and whose primary function was to terrorize and eliminate anyone Ivan deemed a traitor, especially the old boyar families. It's like watching a seemingly rational leader suddenly create a private, terrifying police force, answerable only to him, and then unleash them on his own people. Historians still argue whether the Oprichnina was a calculated effort to break the power of the independent boyar aristocracy and cement autocracy, or simply the manifestation of a deeply disturbed psyche. Perhaps it was a horrifying blend of both. The Oprichnina was a period of unimaginable violence and repression. Villages were destroyed, entire families massacred, and leading boyars executed, often after grotesque tortures. The most notorious act was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, where thousands of innocent citizens were tortured and killed on Ivan's orders, fueled by a baseless suspicion that the city was plotting to defect to Poland-Lithuania. Imagine the sheer horror of living in a time when the Tsar's capriciousness could lead to the wholesale destruction of a prosperous city where loyalty meant nothing and suspicion everything. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Productive lands were laid waste, trade routes disrupted, and countless peasants fled to escape the oprichniki, leading to widespread depopulation and a severe economic crisis. It severely weakened the state in the long run, even as it centralized power in Ivan's hands. Despite the internal turmoil, Ivan IV also pursued an active foreign policy. He successfully conquered the Khanats of Kazan, 1552, and Astrakhan, 1556, extending Russian control down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea and opening up new trade routes. These victories were significant, pushing Russia's borders further south and east, and removing lingering threats from the remnants of the Golden Horde. He also began the process of Russian expansion into Siberia, a vast and resource-rich territory, marking the very beginnings of Russia's eastward push towards the Pacific. However, his long and ultimately disastrous Livonian War, 1558-1583, fought for access to the Baltic Sea against a coalition of Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, drained Russia's resources and ended in a humiliating defeat, highlighting the limits of his military might despite the reforms. The war, which dragged on for 25 years, was a colossal drain, showcasing that even a terrible Tsar could not defy geopolitical realities. Perhaps the most chilling incident of his personal tyranny was the widely reported killing of his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581, during a fit of rage, leaving a weaker, mentally unstable son, Fyodor III, to inherit the throne. This act, whether accidental or intentional, tragically undermined the very dynasty he had worked so ruthlessly to establish, setting the stage for one of Russia's most chaotic periods. Ivan the Terrible left a paradoxical legacy, a stronger, more centralized state, but one built on a foundation of terror, economic devastation, and a deep-seated fear of authority that would profoundly shape the character of Russian autocracy for centuries to come. From the chilling autocratic grip of Ivan the Terrible, Russia plunged headlong into one of its most desperate and chaotic chapters, aptly named the Time of Troubles. Imagine a vast kingdom, recently unified and strengthened, suddenly unraveling like a badly knit garment, its threads fraying into civil war, famine, foreign invasion, and a bewildering succession of pretenders to the throne. This wasn't just a political crisis. It was an existential struggle that nearly extinguished the nascent Russian state, a period so fraught with danger that it's a wonder Russia emerged at all. The direct cause was the end of the Rurik dynasty, the very lineage that had ruled for centuries. Ivan the Terrible's capable eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, was dead, likely by his father's hand. His surviving son, Fyodor I, who ascended the throne in 1584, was pious and gentle, but reportedly weak-minded and uninterested in state affairs. He was more concerned with church bells than matters of state, leaving the actual governance to his powerful brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Fyodor's reign was largely stable due to Godunov's effective regency. But the crucial problem was the lack of an heir. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia since the 9th century, came to an end. This dynastic crisis immediately opened a power vacuum, and Boris Godunov, initially popular and a shrewd administrator, was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor. However, his claim to the throne was not universally accepted, and he faced skepticism from some of the old boyar families who resented his rapid rise to power. His reign was further plagued by immense natural disasters, particularly the devastating Russian famine of 1601-1603, caused by unusually cold summers and crop failures. This famine, leading to widespread starvation and social unrest, was so severe that people resorted to cannibalism, a horrifying testament to the depth of the crisis. Historians still debate whether the famine was simply an act of nature or if Godunov's administration exacerbated it through poor policies. But its impact was undeniable, fueling widespread discontent and undermining his legitimacy. It's almost as if the heavens themselves were conspiring against the new, unelected Tsar. This widespread suffering provided fertile ground for the emergence of pretenders, the most famous of whom was false Dmitry I. This enigmatic figure, who appeared in Poland, claimed to be Tsarevich Dmitry, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, who had supposedly died in Uglich in 1591, widely believed to have been murdered on Godunov's orders. Now, remember that mystery from Ivan the Terrible's reign. Here it is again, resurfacing with a vengeance. False Dmitry, charismatic and surprisingly convincing, gained Polish support and a following among disaffected Russian peasants and Cossacks. In 1605, after Boris Godunov's sudden death, false Dmitry I marched into Moscow and was crowned Tsar, briefly restoring a semblance of order. His reign, however, was short-lived. His pro-Polish leanings, his disregard for Russian customs, and perhaps his own arrogance alienated both the boyars and the Orthodox Church. In 1606, he was overthrown and murdered in a boyar-led uprising, sparking a new wave of chaos. His body was famously dismembered, burned, and its ashes shot from a cannon towards Poland, a truly macabre farewell to a most unusual ruler. The ensuing years saw an astonishing carousel of rulers and impostors. Vasily Shuisky, a boyar who led the coup against false Dmitry, was proclaimed Tsar. But he too faced numerous challenges, including the appearance of false Dmitry II, who also claimed to be the miraculously surviving Tsarevich. This second impostor, supported by Poles and Swedes, gained significant traction, even establishing a rival court near Moscow. Russia was now caught in a devastating civil war, with multiple centers of power, banditry rampant, and the peasantry suffering terribly from raids by various armed groups. The state was effectively disintegrating. To make matters worse, foreign powers, sensing Russia's weakness, intervened directly. Poland-Lithuania, under King Sigismund III, Vasa, invaded, besieging Smolensk and even occupying Moscow itself in 1610, establishing a Polish garrison in the Kremlin. Sweden also intervened, occupying Novgorod and laying claim to Russian territories in the north. It was a humiliating moment for Russia to have foreign troops occupying its very heart, a scenario that would be unthinkable just a few decades prior. Historians still debate the full extent of Polish ambitions during this period. Was it a genuine attempt to establish a dynastic union, or simply to exploit Russia's weakness for territorial gain? Regardless, the presence of foreign occupiers, particularly the Catholic Poles in Orthodox Moscow, galvanized a powerful sense of national and religious identity among the Russian people. This collective outrage ultimately proved to be the turning point. Local militias, largely composed of peasants, townsfolk, and gentry, began to form, driven by patriotism and a desire to expel the invaders and restore order. The most famous of these was the volunteer army led by Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a military commander. This national liberation movement, drawing strength from the Orthodox Church and popular support, marched on Moscow, engaging the Polish forces in fierce fighting. In 1612, the Polish garrison in the Kremlin finally surrendered, marking a decisive victory and the end of foreign occupation. The time of troubles had stripped Russia bare, revealing its fragility without a legitimate ruler. Yet, in its darkest hour, it also forged a stronger, more unified national consciousness, a realization that collective action was necessary for survival. The stage was now set for the election of a new Tsar, one who would finally bring stability and begin the long process of rebuilding a shattered realm. And so, after the terrifying maelstrom of the time of troubles, with foreign invaders expelled and the capital liberated, Russia stood on the precipice, desperate for stability and a legitimate sovereign. Imagine the mood in Moscow in 1613, a city battered but defiant, a nation exhausted by civil war, famine, and foreign occupation, longing for a return to normalcy. It was in this atmosphere of hopeful exhaustion that the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, was convened once more, charged with the momentous task of electing a new Tsar. This wasn't a choice made lightly. The future of Russia hung in the balance, a future that, if misjudged, could send them back into the abyss of chaos. Unlike the hurried, often contested ascensions of the Troubles, this election was meant to legitimize the new dynasty, to provide a clear, undisputed line of succession after decades of impostors and disputed claims. The Sobor, composed of boyars, clergy, gentry, merchants, and even some representatives of the peasantry, debated various candidates. Many considered a foreign prince, hoping to bring peace through an internationally recognized monarch, but the popular sentiment, fueled by the recent patriotic struggle against the Poles and Swedes, leaned strongly towards a native Russian, one tied to the Orthodox Church. The choice eventually fell upon a young, relatively unassuming 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. Now, why Mikhail? He was certainly no military hero or charismatic leader. His primary qualification was his lineage. He was the grandnephew of Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan the Terrible's first and beloved wife, thus connecting him, however tenuously, to the old Rurik dynasty. More importantly, his father, Patriarch Filaret, was a highly respected and influential church leader who had suffered greatly during the Troubles, having been held captive by the Poles. Filaret's moral authority and connection to the church were immense assets, providing the crucial legitimacy that the new dynasty so desperately needed. It was less about Mikhail's personal qualities and more about the symbolic weight he carried: a clean slate, a fresh start, and a link to a more stable past. It was as if they picked the safest, most unassuming option, hoping his very lack of ambition would be a source of strength. The election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613 was a watershed moment, marking the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries, until the very end of the empire we are discussing. His ascent to the throne didn't magically solve all of Russia's problems overnight, of course. The early years of his reign were largely overseen by his powerful father, Patriarch Filaret, who returned from Polish captivity and became effectively a co-ruler, albeit with the title of Patriarch. This dual authority, while unusual, provided a strong and stable hand during the crucial period of rebuilding. Imagine a powerful spiritual leader working hand in glove with the young Tsar, guiding the ship of state through choppy waters. Together, they focused on restoring order, suppressing banditry, and rebuilding the shattered economy. This period involved consolidating control over rebellious regions and reasserting the authority of the central government, a tedious but essential process after years of decentralization. The immediate priorities for the new Romanov regime were to conclude the long-running wars with Sweden and Poland. The Treaty of Stolbovo in 1617 with Sweden forced Russia to cede territories along the Baltic coast, essentially cutting Russia off from direct access to the sea for a time, a strategic setback. However, it secured peace in the north. The war with Poland dragged on longer, but the Truce of Dulino in 1618 was a more favorable outcome, although Poland did retain some western territories, including Smolensk. These treaties, while not entirely glorious, were crucial for allowing Russia to focus on internal recovery without the constant drain of external conflict. They were about pragmatic survival, not grand conquest. Under Mikhail and Filaret, the system of serfdom, which had been slowly developing over the preceding centuries, became even more entrenched. The Ulozhenie of 1649, a comprehensive legal code enacted under Mikhail's son, Alexei formally tied peasants to the land, transforming them into legal property, essentially cementing their status as serfs. This was a response to the devastating depopulation of the time of troubles, as landowners desperately sought to retain their labor force. This legal codification of serfdom had profound and long-lasting consequences for Russian society, creating a vast class of unfree labor and deeply embedding social inequality, a legacy that would haunt Russia for centuries and contribute to future unrest. It's one of those historical facts that makes you wince, knowing the immense human cost involved. The Romanovs also began the slow process of institutional reform, strengthening the bureaucracy and the military. They initiated efforts to modernize the army along Western lines, bringing in foreign military instructors and adopting new tactics and weapons. This was a pragmatic response to the lessons learned during the time of troubles, where Russia's military had often been outmatched by its Western rivals. This gradual but consistent strengthening of the central state, the recovery of the economy, and the restoration of social order were the hallmarks of the early Romanov reign. They were less about flashy conquests and more about steady, often painstaking nation-building. By the time Mikhail died in 1645, he had succeeded in his primary task. He had stabilized Russia, healed many of its wounds, and ensured the survival of the state. He may not have been a dynamic figure, but his very presence, coupled with his father's acumen, provided the essential foundation for the dynasty that would eventually transform Russia into a truly global empire, laying the groundwork for the towering figure who would arrive on the scene just a few decades later. Having navigated the tumultuous early years of the Romanov dynasty, We now arrive at the threshold of a truly transformative era, one dominated by a figure so monumental that he almost single-handedly dragged Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern age, Peter the Great. Imagine a monarch who was not merely a ruler, but a force of nature, towering in stature, with a boundless energy and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, who would personally learn shipbuilding in Holland and pull teeth as a hobby. His reign from 1682, though he effectively ruled alone from 1696 to 1725, was a whirlwind of radical reforms, ambitious wars, and a complete reorientation of Russia's geopolitical and cultural identity. It's almost as if he decided, upon waking one morning, that Russia was simply too medieval for his liking and needed a complete, top-to-bottom overhaul. Peter's vision was clear. Russia, isolated and largely backward compared to the burgeoning powers of Western Europe, needed to modernize, to westernize, and to become a major player on the European stage. He famously embarked on the Grand Embassy in 1697-1698, traveling incognito throughout Western Europe, working in shipyards, meeting with monarchs and intellectuals, and absorbing every aspect of Western technology, administration, and culture. Historians still argue whether this trip was primarily for military and technical knowledge, or if it also profoundly shaped his understanding of enlightened absolutism and the need for comprehensive reform. Regardless, it was an unprecedented act for a reigning monarch, a true hands-on approach to statecraft, rather than simply issuing decrees from a throne. He was less of a distant sovereign and more of a practical apprentice, albeit one with an entire empire at his command. Upon his return, Peter unleashed a torrent of reforms, often implemented with brutal efficiency and a complete disregard for tradition. He famously ordered his boyars to shave their long beards and adopt Western dress, a seemingly superficial change that was, in fact, a deeply symbolic assault on traditional Russian identity and a forced march towards European fashion norms. He knew that to change the mindset, you sometimes had to change the outward appearance. More fundamentally, he abolished the ancient Boyar Duma, replacing it with the governing Senate, a more centralized and efficient administrative body. He reorganized the entire government structure, creating colleges, ministries, based on Swedish models, and introduced a new system of local administration to improve control over his vast realm. He also introduced the Table of Ranks in 1722, a revolutionary system that based status and promotion in state service and the military on merit and service to the Tsar rather than on aristocratic birth. This allowed talented individuals from lower social strata to rise, effectively breaking the power of the old nobility and creating a new service elite loyal directly to the monarch. It was a groundbreaking social mobility initiative, albeit one dictated entirely from the top. However, Peter's reforms were not driven by an abstract love of enlightenment. They were primarily geared towards one overarching goal: building a powerful military capable of securing Russia's access to the sea and establishing its dominance. His relentless pursuit of a warm water port led to the epic Great Northern War, 1700-1721, against Sweden, then a dominant power in the Baltic. This was a brutal, protracted conflict that tested Russia's resources and resilience to their limits. Initially, Russia suffered humiliating defeats, most notably at the Battle of Narva in 1700, where a smaller Swedish force decimated Peter's poorly trained and equipped army. But Peter learned quickly, rebuilding his army from scratch, implementing universal conscription, and establishing a professional navy. He understood that sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war, and he was a remarkably quick study. The tide turned decisively at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where Peter's reformed army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Swedes, essentially ending Sweden's imperial ambitions and marking Russia's emergence as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. It was a truly pivotal moment, a changing of the guard on the European stage. With victory assured, Peter founded a new capital city in 1703, St. Petersburg, on the marshy, windswept shores of the Neva River, wrested from Sweden. This wasn't just a new city. It was a deliberate and defiant statement, a window to the West, physically embodying his vision of a modern European Russia. The construction of St. Petersburg was a monumental undertaking, built at immense human cost, a testament to Peter's iron will. Imagine thousands of serfs and prisoners toiling in the harsh conditions, draining swamps and laying foundations. A city literally rising from the mud by sheer force of imperial ambition. Peter's reforms were comprehensive and often brutal, earning him the moniker the Great, but also the Terrible in some interpretations. He drastically increased taxation to fund his wars and reforms, often leading to peasant rebellions which were ruthlessly suppressed. He brought the Russian Orthodox Church under direct state control, abolishing the Patriarchate and replacing it with the Holy Synod, a state-controlled body headed by a secular official. This move, a masterstroke of state power, further centralized authority and ensured the Church's loyalty to the Tsar, eliminating a potential rival center of power. When Peter died in 1725, he left behind a transformed Russia, a formidable military and naval power, a modernized bureaucracy, a new capital, and a populace forever altered by his relentless drive for change. He had dragged Russia into the European concert of nations, but at a tremendous cost in human suffering and the reinforcement of an autocratic, often ruthless, state power that would define the empire for centuries to come. His legacy, like his personality, remains a complex blend of genius and brutality, progress and oppression. From the towering shadow of Peter the Great, the narrative of the Russian Empire moves into a period often characterized by palace coups and shifting influences, yet one that still saw the continuation of Peter's westernizing impulses, particularly under the reign of his daughter, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Imagine, if you will, the glittering, intricate world of the Russian court after Peter's death, a place where power was often seized through intrigue and cunning, a stark contrast to Peter's forceful, direct rule. The decades immediately following Peter's demise were marked by a succession of weak or short-lived rulers: his wife, Catherine the, his grandson, Peter II, and his niece, Anna Ivanovna, each reign vulnerable to the machinations of powerful court factions and the whims of the imperial guard. It was a bit like a high-stakes, real-life game of musical chairs, with the crown as the ultimate prize, often decided by who could muster the most loyal regiments at the right moment It was into this volatile environment that Elizabeth Petrovna, the vivacious and intelligent daughter of Peter the Great, made her dramatic entrance. She was popular with the common people, and perhaps more crucially, with the influential imperial guard, who remembered her father's glory and saw her as a direct link to his legacy. In 1741, Elizabeth, with the support of the Preobrazhensky Guard Regiment, staged a successful bloodless coup, overthrowing the infant Ivan VI and his regent mother, Anna Leopoldovna. Imagine the scene: a determined princess, clad in a guard's uniform, leading soldiers through the palace corridors, asserting her birthright with a blend of charm and decisive action. Her ascension was widely celebrated, seen as a return to Peter's vision after a period of perceived German influence under Anna Ivanovna. Elizabeth's reign, spanning from 1741 to 1762, is often described as a period of cultural flourishing and a continuation of Peter's policies, but with a decidedly more refined and less brutal approach. She was, in many ways, the stylish and artistic heir to her father's utilitarian drive. While Peter built ships and fought wars, Elizabeth built palaces and patronized the arts. She famously detested the death penalty, suspending it throughout her reign, a remarkably humane stance for the era. However, this didn't mean Russia became a bastion of liberty. The system of serfdom remained deeply entrenched, and the nobility continued to enjoy immense privileges. Historians sometimes debate whether her apparent leniency was a sign of genuine enlightenment or simply a characteristic of her personality, less inclined to the harshness that marked earlier reigns. Regardless, it provided a welcome respite from the terror of Ivan the Terrible and the intense pressure of Peter the Great. Under Elizabeth, Russia saw significant cultural and intellectual advancements. She founded the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg in 1757 and, crucially, the Moscow State University in 1755, thanks to the efforts of her brilliant polymath advisor, Mikhail Lomonosov. These institutions were instrumental in fostering education, science, and the arts, marking a significant step in Russia's intellectual development and creating an educated elite that would later, ironically, begin to question the very foundations of autocracy. She also famously oversaw the construction of the magnificent Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, designed by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, a dazzling example of Russian Baroque architecture that still stands as a testament to her love of grandeur and beauty. The court under Elizabeth was renowned for its lavish balls, theatrical performances, and an unparalleled level of opulence, making St. Petersburg a true rival to the grand European capitals. It was a period of flamboyant indulgence, a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble asceticism of Peter's personal life. In terms of foreign policy, Elizabeth's reign was marked by Russia's increasing involvement in European affairs. The most significant conflict was the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, a global conflict that saw Russia allied with Austria and France against Prussia and Great Britain. Russian armies performed remarkably well, even occupying Berlin at one point in 1760. Imagine Russian troops marching through the streets of Berlin, a sight that would be repeated centuries later, but for very different reasons. The war demonstrated Russia's growing military might and its status as a major European power. a testament to Peter the Great's military reforms finally bearing full fruit. However, Russia's gains from this war were ultimately undone by Elizabeth's sudden death in 1762. Her successor, her nephew Peter III, a fervent admirer of Frederick the Great of Prussia, immediately withdrew Russia from the war, signing a separate peace treaty that stunned Russia's allies and saved Prussia from certain defeat. This abrupt policy reversal highlighted the personal nature of autocratic rule and the immense power wielded by the monarch, even if it meant throwing away years of costly victories. The sudden and unexpected conclusion of the 7 Years' War, robbing Russia of potential territorial gains and diplomatic leverage, left many at court disgruntled. Peter III's erratic behavior, his overt pro-Prussian sentiments, his contempt for the Orthodox Church, and his general disregard for Russian traditions quickly alienated the nobility, the army, and the clergy. He was perceived as an outsider, lacking the genuine connection to Russian identity that Elizabeth had cultivated. His brief reign, lasting only 6 months, was a disaster, a masterclass in how to alienate every major power group in your kingdom. His lack of judgment and his perceived threat to the traditional order set the stage for yet another palace coup, one that would bring to power an even more formidable and complex figure, a German princess who would become one of Russia's most iconic and impactful rulers, further cementing the empire's place on the world stage, but also deepening some of its internal contradictions. From the opulent, if somewhat unstable court of Empress Elizabeth, we transition to the extraordinary reign of Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great. Imagine a young German princess, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, arriving in Russia as a reluctant bride for the future Tsar Peter III, speaking no Russian, and utterly immersed in Western Enlightenment ideals. Her path to power was as dramatic and audacious as any fictional narrative. Peter III, as we remember, was a deeply unpopular and erratic ruler whose contempt for Russian customs and the Orthodox Church, coupled with his pro-Prussian policies, quickly alienated the very elites he needed to rule. Historians still argue whether his mental instability was a result of illness or simply a profound mismatch with the demands of the Russian throne. Regardless, his brief reign was a ticking time bomb. Catherine, astute and intelligent, played her hand masterfully. She cultivated relationships within the court, learned Russian, embraced orthodoxy with fervent devotion, and presented herself as a true champion of Russian interests, in stark contrast to her husband. In 1762, just 6 months after Peter III ascended the throne, Catherine, with the crucial support of the Imperial Guard, whose loyalty was swayed by her charisma and Peter's folly, staged a swift and bloodless coup. Peter III was arrested and shortly thereafter died under mysterious circumstances, most likely murdered by one of Catherine's co-conspirators. Imagine the sheer audacity and calculated risk of such a move. A foreign-born empress seizing the throne from her own husband, solidifying her power with the unspoken threat of violence. Her ascension wasn't based on lineage. Her son Paul was the legitimate heir, but on a formidable combination of political skill, strategic alliances, and raw ambition. Catherine's reign from 1762 to 1796 is widely considered a golden age for the Russian Empire, often referred to as the enlightened absolutism of Russia. She corresponded with leading European Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, presenting herself as a philosopher queen, eager to modernize Russia according to rational principles. She initially aimed for significant legal and administrative reforms, even convening the Legislative Commission in 1767, a grand assembly of representatives from various social classes to codify laws and discuss societal issues. Her instruction, nakaz, to this commission, drawing heavily from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, advocated for legal equality and a reduction in torture and capital punishment. However, the commission ultimately failed to produce a comprehensive new code. Bogged down by internal disagreements and the sheer complexity of reforming such a vast and diverse empire. This episode, though ultimately inconclusive in its immediate legislative output, highlighted Catherine's reformist intentions, even if the realities of Russian society often proved resistant to radical change. It was a grand intellectual experiment that bumped up against stubborn reality. Despite the legislative setbacks, Catherine achieved remarkable territorial expansion, greatly increasing Russia's power and influence on the European stage. Her foreign policy was nothing short of brilliant. The two Russo-Turkish wars, 1768-1774 and 1787-1792, were immensely successful, securing Russia's long-sought access to the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula, a vital strategic warm water port. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, 1774, was particularly significant, giving Russia the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, a pretext for future interventions. Imagine the thrill of seeing Russia finally achieve this centuries-old ambition, pushing the Ottoman Empire back and asserting its dominance in the south. But perhaps Catherine's most controversial and impactful foreign policy achievement was her role in the partitions of Poland. Alongside Prussia and Austria, Russia participated in 3 partitions of the weak and internally divided Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1772, 1793, and 1795. These acts of naked aggression effectively erased Poland from the map of Europe for over a century, bringing vast new territories and millions of new subjects, including a large Jewish population under Russian rule. Historians still argue vehemently over the morality of these partitions, viewing them as a cynical act of power politics that violated national sovereignty. Yet for Russia, they represented a massive expansion westward, pushing its borders deep into Central Europe and bringing it into direct contact with the great powers of the continent. It was a geopolitical coup, a land grab on an epic scale, but one with lasting repercussions and a complex legacy for all involved. While Catherine cultivated an image of enlightenment, the internal realities of the empire remained deeply contradictory. The vast majority of the population, the serfs, saw their burdens increase and their legal rights diminished. The nobility, in contrast, enjoyed a golden age of privileges and exemptions from service, further entrenching the social hierarchy. This growing chasm between the privileged few and the suffering masses would eventually erupt into violent rebellion, reminding the empress that even a philosopher queen could not escape the deep-seated grievances of her realm. As Catherine the Great basked in the glow of her enlightened image and celebrated her vast territorial gains, a simmering discontent among the vast unfree population of the Russian Empire was about to erupt into a conflagration that would shake the very foundations of her rule. Imagine, if you will, the whispers of injustice echoing across the vast plains, carried on the wind from isolated villages and distant Cossack camps. Tales of unbearable burdens, of landlords wielding absolute power, and of a system that offered no hope for the common man. This simmering resentment exploded in the form of Pugachev's rebellion, 1773-1775, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. A stark reminder that even the most enlightened autocrat ruled over a deeply unequal and volatile society. The leader of this immense revolt was Yemelyan Pugachev, a Don Cossack, a man who, if he were alive today, would undoubtedly be labeled a populist demagogue, perhaps even a cult leader, given the fervor he inspired. He was a veteran of the 7 Years' War and the Russo-Turkish War, a man intimately familiar with military organization and the grievances of the lower classes. Crucially, Pugachev exploited the enduring popular belief that Tsar Peter III, Catherine's murdered husband, had not truly died but was in hiding, biding his time to return and liberate the people from oppression. This messianic belief, a common trope in times of instability, gave Pugachev's claim incredible legitimacy in the eyes of the disenfranchised. He cleverly proclaimed himself to be the resurrected Peter III, promising to abolish serfdom, end conscription, and redistribute land, touching upon the deepest desires and grievances of the peasantry and the Cossacks. It's like a historical game of telephone, where a whisper of a dead Tsar became a roar of revolution, all thanks to a charismatic impostor. The rebellion began in the remote Ural region, drawing support from a diverse array of disaffected groups: serfs desperate for freedom, old believers, a persecuted religious minority, non-Russian ethnic groups like the Bashkirs and Tatars, who chafed under Russian rule, and most importantly, the independent-minded Cossacks of the Yaik, Ural River, who resented the government's attempts to curtail their traditional autonomy. These Cossacks, with their martial traditions and fierce independence, formed the backbone of Pugachev's army. The uprising rapidly swelled into a full-scale civil war, spreading across vast swathes of southeastern Russia. Pugachev's forces captured towns, established a rudimentary administration, and in a horrifying inversion of the established order, began to hang landlords and government officials, often from the very gates of their own estates. Imagine the terror of the nobility and the sheer desperate hope of the serfs as this wave of rebellion swept through the countryside. This wasn't just a riot. It was an attempt to fundamentally dismantle the existing social and political order. Catherine's initial response to the rebellion was somewhat hampered by the ongoing Russo-Turkish War, which tied up significant military resources. She initially underestimated the scale and danger of the uprising, dismissing it as merely another local disturbance. However, as the rebellion grew, threatening major cities like Kazan and Orenburg, and as reports of widespread atrocities and the collapse of local authority reached St. Petersburg, the gravity of the situation became undeniably clear. The empress, who had cultivated an image of intellectual enlightenment and firm but just rule, was now faced with a direct, visceral challenge to her authority and the very social contract upon which her empire rested. It must have been a profoundly unsettling experience for her, a sudden, violent crack in the polished facade of her enlightened reign. Eventually, with the successful conclusion of the Russo-Turkish War in 1774, Catherine was able to redeploy seasoned regular army units under experienced generals, notably General Alexander Suvorov, one of Russia's most brilliant military commanders. The disciplined, well-equipped imperial army proved too formidable for Pugachev's largely undisciplined and poorly armed peasant forces. Despite their numerical strength and fierce determination, the tide of the rebellion began to turn, and Pugachev's army suffered a series of decisive defeats. Pugachev himself was betrayed by his own Cossack followers, eager to secure their own pardons, and captured in September 1774. He was brought to Moscow in an iron cage, a gruesome spectacle designed to instill fear and demonstrate the inevitable fate of rebels. In January 1775, he was publicly executed in Moscow's Bolotnaya Square, his body drawn and quartered, a brutal public display of imperial power and a grim warning to any who dare to challenge the Tsar. The suppression of Pugachev's rebellion had profound and lasting consequences for the Russian Empire. Far from ushering in new reforms, it instilled a deep conservative fear in Catherine and her successors. The brief flirtation with enlightened ideals gave way to a renewed emphasis on strengthening autocracy and increasing control over the peasantry. The power of the nobility was further cemented as a bulwark against future revolts, and serfdom, far from being abolished, became even more rigorously enforced. Catherine also embarked on administrative reforms, dividing the empire into more manageable provinces and districts, strengthening the local bureaucracy and police force, all designed to prevent similar uprisings from taking root. While the rebellion itself failed, it left an indelible mark, demonstrating the immense social pressures building beneath the surface of imperial grandeur and highlighting the deep, unaddressed grievances that would continue to plague Russia for centuries, ultimately contributing to the empire's eventual downfall. It was a potent, terrifying reminder that beneath the gilded palaces, the majority of the population was suffering, and their patience was far from infinite. Having witnessed the internal turmoil unleashed by Pugachev's rebellion, we now pivot to a period where Russia, having asserted its dominance in Eastern Europe under Catherine the Great, found itself drawn into the epic, continent-spanning conflicts of the Napoleonic Wars. Imagine Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a continent in convulsion, shaken first by the French Revolution, and then by the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius who redrew the map of Europe with astonishing speed and ruthlessness. For Russia, this era was not merely about defending its borders. It was about asserting its role as a great power, a pivotal player in the grand coalition against a seemingly unstoppable force. It's almost as if Russia, having just put out a massive internal fire, suddenly found itself called upon to help extinguish a continent-wide inferno. The initial response of the Russian Empire to revolutionary France was one of deep suspicion and hostility. Catherine the Great, a staunch monarchist, was horrified by the regicide and radicalism of the French Revolution. Her successor, Paul I, Catherine's son, whose brief and eccentric reign, 1796–1801, was marked by a volatile temperament and a series of contradictory policies, initially joined the Second Coalition against France. Russian forces, under the brilliant but difficult General Alexander Suvorov, achieved remarkable victories in Italy and Switzerland, showcasing Russian military prowess abroad. However, Paul's unpredictable shifts in alliance, his brief rapprochement with Napoleon, and his increasingly autocratic and paranoid rule ultimately led to his assassination in 1801, another dramatic palace coup that historians still debate was actively orchestrated or simply allowed to happen by his disgruntled nobility and military officers. His death cleared the way for his son, Alexander I, a ruler of complex character and initially liberal leanings, to take the throne. Alexander I's reign, 1801–1825, would be inextricably linked with the struggle against Napoleon. Initially, Alexander harbored some admiration for Enlightenment ideals and even considered constitutional reforms for Russia. But the escalating conflict with Napoleon quickly overshadowed these domestic aspirations. Russia joined the Third Coalition against France, leading to the devastating defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, where the combined Austrian and Russian armies were decisively routed by Napoleon's Grande Armée. It was a humiliating blow, a stark reminder of Napoleon's tactical genius and the need for further military modernization. Imagine the shock and dismay back in St. Petersburg as news of the catastrophic loss reached the imperial court. Following further defeats, particularly at Friedland in 1807, Alexander I was forced to conclude the Treaty of Tilsit with Napoleon. This agreement, signed on a raft in the middle of the Neman River, ostensibly made Russia an ally of France and forced it to join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade aimed at crippling Great Britain. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely intended to uphold the treaty, or if it was merely a strategic pause to rebuild his forces. Regardless, Tilsit was deeply unpopular within Russia, especially among the nobility and merchants who relied on trade with Britain. It felt like an enforced submission, a bitter pill to swallow for a proud great power. The alliance was always uneasy, and tensions mounted as Russia secretly continued to trade with Britain and Napoleon's ambitions grew ever larger. The inevitable rupture came in 1812. Napoleon, frustrated by Russia's non-compliance and aiming to crush the last independent great power on the continent, launched his catastrophic invasion of Russia with an army of over 600,000 men, the largest invasion force ever assembled in Europe to that point. This was the famous Patriotic War of 1812. Imagine the sheer scale of this undertaking, an army stretching for miles, marching deep into the vast, unforgiving Russian interior. The Russian strategy, largely masterminded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, was one of strategic retreat, avoiding decisive pitched battles, drawing the French deeper into the vastness of Russia, stretching their supply lines, and allowing the brutal Russian winter to become their most formidable ally. This was not a popular strategy initially, causing frustration among those who wanted to stand and fight. but it proved to be a stroke of strategic genius. The only major pitched battle was the incredibly bloody Battle of Borodino outside Moscow in September 1812. A tactical draw, but a strategic Russian retreat that left the path to Moscow open. Alexander the Hun made the agonizing decision to abandon Moscow, allowing it to be occupied by the French, who found it largely deserted and then engulfed in a massive fire, the origins of which are still debated, but which effectively denied Napoleon any strategic advantage from its capture. This was an unprecedented act of defiance, sacrificing the ancient capital to defeat the invader. Napoleon, finding himself in a burnt, deserted city with no supplies and winter rapidly approaching, was forced to begin his disastrous retreat in October 1812. The retreat, harried by Cossacks and partisan detachments, decimated by starvation, disease, and the relentless cold, became one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. Of Napoleon's original army, only a fraction returned. It was a victory not just of Russian arms, but of Russian geography and climate, a truly epic tale of survival against overwhelming odds. The victory of 1812 cemented Russia's status as a formidable military power and a liberator of Europe. Alexander I, now seen as the savior of Europe, played a leading role in the subsequent campaigns that eventually led to Napoleon's defeat and abdication. Russian troops marched into Paris in 1814, a triumphant moment that solidified Russia's prestige and influence. At the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's defeat, Russia gained significant new territories, including most of Poland, renamed Congress Poland, further expanding its western borders. The Napoleonic Wars, therefore, while immensely costly in human lives and resources, ultimately elevated Russia to an unprecedented position of power and prestige on the European continent, a position it would strive to maintain for the rest of its imperial existence. Emerging from the Napoleonic Wars as a dominant European power, Russia, under Alexander I, seemed poised for an era of internal reform, perhaps even a liberalization that would match its newfound international prestige. But remember, the victory against Napoleon had been achieved by an autocratic system, bolstered by a vast army and the deep loyalty of a populace that largely consisted of serfs. This inherent contradiction between the emperor's fleeting liberal sympathies and the ingrained realities of Russian society would soon lead to a pivotal clash, the Decembrist Revolt. Imagine the mood among some of the younger, more educated officers and nobles returning from the wars in Europe. They had witnessed societies with constitutions, civil liberties, and a more vibrant intellectual life. They had fought alongside soldiers from nations where serfdom was a relic of the past, and they returned to a homeland where absolute monarchy and human bondage remained the norm. This exposure to Western ideas, far from strengthening autocracy, planted seeds of discontent and revolutionary fervor. It was almost as if they had gone on a grand tour of enlightenment, only to return home to a dimly lit, outdated palace. Alexander I, initially hailed as a liberal reformer, did indeed dabble with constitutional ideas and even granted a constitution to Congress Poland. But his commitment to genuine reform in Russia itself wavered and ultimately faded. The sheer scale of Russia, the entrenched power of the nobility, and the fear of social upheaval after the Pugachev rebellion weighed heavily on him. His later years were marked by a growing mysticism and a drift towards more conservative and repressive policies, overseen by figures like General Alexei Arakcheyev, who implemented military settlements known as Arakcheyevshchina, a harsh and unpopular system that combined military service with agricultural labor. This growing conservatism frustrated many of the young idealistic officers who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and dreamed of a more modern Russia. These disaffected officers, largely from the gentry class, began to form secret societies, inspired by Masonic lodges and European revolutionary movements. They debated the future of Russia, drafting various proposals ranging from constitutional monarchy to a republican system, all of which involved the abolition of serfdom. The two most prominent groups were the Northern Society, which favored a constitutional monarchy and a more gradual approach to reform, and the Southern Society, led by the more radical Pavel Pestel, which advocated for a republican government and the immediate abolition of serfdom, even considering regicide as a means to achieve their goals. These intellectual salons, often filled with passionate debate and clandestine planning, were a world away from the Tsar's court. Yet they harbored the seeds of its undoing. The moment of truth arrived unexpectedly with the sudden death of Alexander in December 1825. His death created a succession crisis. Alexander had no legitimate male heir. His younger brother, Constantine, had secretly renounced his claim to the throne years earlier, but this renunciation was not widely known. The next in line was their younger brother, Nicholas I, a stern and conservative figure. This period of confusion, during which the Imperial Guard and government officials initially swore allegiance to Constantine, who was in Warsaw and refused to accept, provided the conspirators with a narrow window of opportunity. They decided to act, hoping to capitalize on the uncertainty and rally support for their cause. On December 14th, 1825, hence Decembrist, a group of officers, primarily from the Northern Society, led about 3,000 soldiers into Senate Square in St. Petersburg. They refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas I, demanding a constitution and a new political order. Imagine the scene. Freezing temperatures, a square filled with bewildered soldiers and curious onlookers, facing off against loyalist troops, with the fate of Russia hanging in the balance. It was a dramatic, if somewhat poorly executed, attempt at a military coup. The conspirators, however, lacked a clear leader, a unified plan, and decisive action. Their chosen leader, Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, failed to appear, leaving the rebels leaderless and indecisive. Nicholas I, a man of strong will and decisive action, swiftly rallied loyal troops, and after attempts at negotiation failed, ordered his artillery to open fire on the square. The revolt was crushed within hours, leading to dozens of deaths and hundreds of arrests. The Decembrist revolt, though a dismal failure in its immediate goals, had profound and long-lasting consequences for the Russian Empire. Nicholas I, having witnessed the vulnerability of the autocracy to liberal ideas, became a staunch and uncompromising defender of absolute power. He initiated a period of intense reaction and repression, famously stating, "Revolution is at the threshold of Russia. but I swear that it will not enter it as long as I live. He created the third section of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery, a powerful secret police force charged with suppressing dissent, censoring publications, and monitoring all aspects of Russian life. This new apparatus of state control was designed to prevent any future challenges to the autocracy, establishing a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and fear. Historians still argue whether this reaction was an overzealous response or a necessary measure to preserve stability in a volatile empire. The Decembrists themselves faced harsh punishment. 5 of the leaders, including Pavel Pestel, were executed by hanging, an unprecedented act for noble conspirators in Russia. Hundreds of others were exiled to hard labor in Siberia, their stories becoming a powerful myth of sacrifice and martyrdom for future generations of revolutionaries. The Decembrist revolt solidified Nicholas III's autocratic rule and set Russia on a deeply conservative path for the next 3 decades. It pushed intellectual and political discourse underground, forcing revolutionary ideas into clandestine circles, only to re-emerge with even greater force in later centuries. The light of reform that had flickered under Alexander Thumb was extinguished, replaced by the grim determination of an emperor committed to maintaining order at all costs, ensuring that the legacy of 1825 would continue to reverberate through Russia's history. With the Decembrist revolt brutally suppressed, Nicholas I ascended to the throne in an atmosphere thick with suspicion and the grim determination to never again face such a challenge to his autocratic power. Imagine an emperor forged in the crucible of rebellion, a man who believed that absolute, unyielding authority was the only bulwark against chaos and revolution. His reign from 1825 to 1855 was defined by a commitment to preserve the existing order, famously encapsulated in his official ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was the foundational dogma of his rule, a rigid philosophy designed to counter the liberal ideas that he believed had infiltrated Russia from the West. Orthodoxy emphasized the supreme role of the Russian Orthodox Church, intertwined with the state. Autocracy declared the Tsars' absolute and unquestionable power, and nationality promoted a sense of unique Russian identity, distinct from Western European influences, often interpreted as Russian chauvinism. It was a complete ideological counter-revolution, a resolute rejection of the very ideas that had inspired the Decembrists to enforce this rigid ideology and prevent any further outbreaks of revolutionary fervor. Nicholas I established a pervasive system of state control and surveillance. The third section of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery, already mentioned, became a powerful and feared secret police force, tasked with monitoring political dissent, censoring publications, and rooting out any perceived threats to the regime. Imagine living in a society where every letter you wrote, every book you read, every conversation you had might be subject to the scrutiny of a pervasive state apparatus. This system of pervasive censorship and repression stifled intellectual and artistic expression, forcing many progressive thinkers into internal exile or emigration. Literary figures like Alexander Pushkin and Mikhail Lermontov found themselves under constant surveillance, their works often censored or suppressed. This wasn't just about catching rebels. It was about controlling the very thoughts and ideas circulating within the empire. A truly monumental undertaking. Despite his fear of reform, Nicholas I was not entirely blind to the country's problems, particularly the deeply ingrained issue of serfdom. He understood that the system, while providing a stable labor force, was economically inefficient and morally indefensible in an increasingly modern world. He even established numerous secret committees to study the peasant question, genuinely seeking solutions for its abolition. However, his profound fear of the social upheaval that such a radical reform would unleash always prevented him from taking decisive action. He famously stated, "There is no doubt that serfdom, in its present form, is a patent evil, but to touch it now would be a still more disastrous evil." This internal contradiction, the recognition of a grave problem without the political will to solve it, would haunt his reign and contribute to Russia's long-term stagnation. Historians still argue whether his inaction was a sign of genuine caution or simply a profound lack of courage when faced with such a monumental task. In foreign policy, Nicholas I was known as the gendarme of Europe, actively intervening to suppress liberal and nationalist revolutions across the continent. He sent Russian troops to crush the Polish uprising of 1830 to 1831, which sought to restore Polish independence, integrating Poland even more tightly into the Russian Empire and revoking its constitutional autonomy. Later, in 1849, he famously sent Russian forces to assist Austria in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution, earning him the gratitude of the Habsburg monarchy, but the enmity of liberals across Europe. These interventions reinforced Russia's image as a reactionary power, a bulwark against the forces of change sweeping through Europe. It was almost as if he saw himself as Europe's chief firefighter, constantly rushing to extinguish the flames of revolution wherever they appeared. Economically, Russia under Nicholas I remained largely agrarian, with its vast majority of the population tied to the land. Industrialization proceeded at a much slower pace compared to Western Europe, largely due to the constraints of serfdom and the autocratic government's general aversion to social change. While some railways were built, notably the line connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow, and early industrial enterprises began to emerge, Russia's economic development lagged significantly behind its European rivals, a fact that would become painfully apparent in the coming decades. This economic backwardness, coupled with the rigid social structure and autocratic rule, created a growing chasm between Russia and the rapidly industrializing and modernizing West. The ultimate test of Nicholas I's system, and the event that would expose its fundamental weaknesses, was the Crimean War, 1853-1856. This conflict, initially sparked by disputes over holy places in the Ottoman Empire, quickly escalated into a major European confrontation involving Russia against a coalition of the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, France, and Sardinia. Imagine the arrogance of a powerful emperor, convinced of his army's invincibility, only to be confronted with the grim reality of modern warfare. The war, fought largely on the Crimean Peninsula, revealed the stark technological and logistical deficiencies of the Russian Empire. Russian soldiers, though brave, were often poorly equipped, armed with outdated muskets, and hampered by a primitive railway system that made supplying troops incredibly difficult. The antiquated sailing ships of the Russian Navy were no match for the steam-powered fleets of Britain and France. The widespread corruption within the army and the bureaucracy further exacerbated these problems. The defeat, a humiliating blow to Russian prestige, shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and exposed the urgent need for fundamental reforms. It was a wake-up call, a harsh reckoning that demonstrated the severe limitations of a state built on serfdom and autocracy in an age of rapid technological and social change. Nicholas I, the unyielding defender of autocracy, died in 1855, just before the end of the war, his reign ending in failure and a profound sense of disillusionment, leaving his son with an empire in crisis. The humiliating defeat in the Crimean War cast a long, cold shadow over Russia, exposing the deep cracks in the edifice of Nicholas III's autocratic system, and proving beyond a doubt that the empire, despite its vastness, was dangerously backward. Imagine the collective shock and dismay that rippled through Russian society as news of the catastrophic losses and the technological superiority of the Allied forces reached every corner of the empire. It was a brutal awakening, forcing the realization that the grand vision of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality simply couldn't compete with the modern industrial and military might of Western Europe. It was as if Russia had entered a cutting-edge, high-tech war with a sword and shield, only to be utterly outmatched by cannons and steamships. Into this atmosphere of national crisis and a desperate need for change stepped Alexander II, who ascended the throne in 1855, inheriting not just an empire, but a profound burden of reform. Unlike his father, Nicholas I, who had feared change above all else, Alexander II understood that radical reform was no longer a choice, but a necessity for Russia's survival as a great power. He famously declared, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it begins to abolish itself from below," a clear acknowledgement of the growing social pressures and the lessons learned from Pugachev's rebellion. This wasn't merely a pragmatic decision. It was a deeply complex moral and political undertaking that would redefine the very fabric of Russian society. The defining act of Alexander II's reign, the one that earned him the moniker Tsar Liberator, was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Imagine the sighs of relief, the hesitant joy, and the immense confusion that swept across the vast Russian countryside as the Tsar's manifesto was read aloud in churches and villages. This monumental decree, freeing approximately 23 million privately owned serfs and an additional 20 million state peasants, was the single largest emancipation of people in history. It was a truly revolutionary act, dismantling a system that had been entrenched for centuries, and upon which the entire social and economic structure of Russia rested. However, historians still argue whether the emancipation was a true liberation or a flawed compromise that ultimately created new problems. While the serfs gained personal freedom and the right to own property, they were required to pay redemption payments over 49 years to their former landlords for the land allotted to them. This often left them with insufficient land, burdened by debt, and still tied to their peasant communes, the mir. which were responsible for collecting the payments. So while chains were broken, new economic ones were forged, leading to widespread disappointment among the peasantry and contributing to future social unrest. It was a grand gesture that, upon closer inspection, revealed a complex and often painful reality for the newly free peasants. The emancipation was just the beginning of Alexander II's great reforms. Recognizing the need for a modern state, he initiated a series of comprehensive transformations. He introduced the Zemstvo reform in 1864, establishing elected local self-government bodies at the district and provincial levels. These Zemstvos, composed of representatives from all social classes, were responsible for local education, healthcare, road maintenance, and agricultural development. This was a significant step towards decentralized administration and greater public participation, a nascent form of local democracy in an autocratic state. Imagine the surprise of local peasants and gentry suddenly sitting together, debating and deciding on local issues. He also reformed the judicial system, introducing public trials, trial by jury, and independent judges in 1864, replacing the old, corrupt, and arbitrary system. This was a radical departure, bringing Russia closer to Western legal norms and establishing a degree of rule of law. Furthermore, military reforms were implemented, including universal conscription, replacing the old, brutal 25-year service for serfs with a shorter compulsory service for all classes, and a modernization of training and equipment, directly addressing the lessons of the Crimean War. Education reforms saw an increase in the number of schools and universities, and restrictions on university autonomy were loosened, fostering a more vibrant intellectual life. Censorship, though still present, was relaxed compared to Nicholas I's reign, leading to a blossoming of the press and public debate. However, despite these sweeping reforms, Alexander II remained an autocrat, unwilling to relinquish his supreme power or introduce a constitution. This fundamental contradiction, liberal reforms within an autocratic framework, created growing frustration among the educated elite and nascent revolutionary groups who felt the reforms did not go far enough. The Tsar's wavering commitment, combined with the slow pace of change and the lingering economic problems of the peasantry, fueled a new wave of radicalism. Students and intellectuals, disillusioned by the limited scope of the reforms, began to embrace revolutionary ideologies, from populism to nihilism. This was a period when the very reforms designed to stabilize Russia inadvertently created the conditions for further unrest, as rising expectations met persistent limitations. Tragically, Alexander II's reign ended in violence. After several assassination attempts, he was killed by a bomb thrown by a member of the revolutionary group People's Will in March 1881, on the very day he was reportedly considering signing a document that would have established a limited representative assembly. His assassination was a devastating blow to the reform movement in Russia, ushering in a period of severe reaction and fundamentally altering the trajectory of the empire. It was a grim irony, a reformist Tsar brought down by the very forces of radicalism that his partial reforms had, in part, inadvertently nurtured, ending an era of profound transformation with a brutal act of violence that would reverberate through the remaining decades of the Russian Empire. The assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar liberator, sent a profound shockwave through the Russian Empire, halting the momentum of reform and ushering in an era of resolute reaction. Imagine the collective horror and fear among the ruling elite. A Tsar who had dared to break the chains of serfdom and introduce sweeping modernizations, violently murdered by revolutionaries. This act, far from igniting a popular uprising, had the opposite effect, creating a deep-seated revulsion for radicalism and strengthening the hand of conservative forces within the government. It was a stark, brutal lesson. Attempts at liberalization, in the eyes of many at the top, had seemingly only led to anarchy and regicide. Alexander II's successor, his son Alexander III, who reigned from 1881 to 1894, was profoundly affected by his father's violent death. He viewed the reforms as having unleashed dangerous forces and believed that the only way to save Russia was to reassert unwavering autocracy. He was a man of immense physical strength and an unyielding will, a stark contrast to his more wavering father. He saw himself as a bulwark against the tide of liberalism and revolution, much like his grandfather Nicholas I. It's almost as if he decided, enough with this Western nonsense. It's time to put Russia back on its true autocratic path. His reign became characterized by a policy of counter-reforms, systematically rolling back many of the liberal innovations of his father and strengthening the central autocratic state. The most immediate and comprehensive of Alexander III's counter-reforms was the strengthening of the secret police and the imposition of even tighter controls over public life. The infamous Okhrana, Department for Protecting the Public Security and Order, was greatly expanded, becoming a highly effective, though brutally repressive, political police force. Imagine a vast network of informers, agents, provocateurs, and pervasive surveillance, reaching into every corner of society, relentlessly hunting down suspected revolutionaries and dissidents. Press censorship was tightened, university autonomy was curtailed, and the powers of the Zemstvos were significantly reduced, bringing local self-government more directly under central government control. Justice, too, reverted to a more arbitrary form, with increased use of administrative exile and summary trials for political offenses, circumventing the more liberal judicial system established by his father. This was a deliberate effort to dismantle the very mechanisms that had allowed for a semblance of public discourse and local initiative. Alexander III also pursued a policy of Russification with renewed vigor, aimed at consolidating the empire by imposing Russian language, culture, and the Orthodox faith on its numerous non-Russian ethnic minorities. In Finland, Poland, the Baltic provinces, and Ukraine, local languages were suppressed in schools and administration, and Orthodox Christianity was promoted over Catholicism, Protestantism, and other faiths. This policy was particularly harsh against the Jewish population, leading to an increase in discriminatory laws and state-sanctioned pogroms, violent anti-Jewish riots that resulted in widespread death and destruction. Historians still argue whether these pogroms were directly orchestrated by the state or simply tolerated and encouraged by its anti-Semitic policies. But their devastating impact on Jewish communities across the Pale of Settlement is undeniable. This forced cultural assimilation, far from unifying the empire, often created deep resentment and fueled nationalist movements among the very groups it sought to suppress, sowing seeds of future unrest and ethnic strife. Despite this intensely conservative and repressive internal policy, Alexander III's reign was largely peaceful in terms of foreign policy. He avoided major wars, earning him the moniker the Peacemaker Tsar. He prioritized internal stability and economic development over military adventures, allowing Russia to recover from the exhaustion of the Crimean War and the costly conquests of Catherine the Great. This focus on peace and internal consolidation allowed for a period of economic growth, particularly in industrialization, which began to pick up pace under the guidance of finance ministers like Sergei Witte. Imagine the immense paradox: a fiercely autocratic regime inadvertently facilitating the very industrialization that would eventually create a large urban working class, a fertile ground for the revolutionary ideologies it so desperately sought to suppress. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, though begun towards the very end of his reign, was emblematic of this drive for economic modernization and imperial integration. This colossal project, spanning thousands of miles across Siberia, was designed to connect European Russia with the Pacific coast, facilitating trade, resource extraction, and military deployment. It was a massive undertaking, showcasing Russia's engineering ambition and its determination to assert its presence across the vast Eurasian landmass. However, beneath the surface of peace and industrial growth, profound social and political tensions continued to fester. The repression of the government pushed revolutionary activity further underground, leading to the formation of more radical and clandestine groups, often embracing increasingly violent methods. The unresolved peasant question, despite the emancipation, continued to be a source of discontent, as many peasants struggled with land shortages and debt. The burgeoning industrial working class, living in often appalling conditions in the rapidly growing cities, became another potential force for unrest, susceptible to revolutionary propaganda. Alexander III died prematurely in 1894, leaving to his son, Nicholas II, an empire that, while outwardly strong and stable, harbored deep-seated contradictions. He had successfully quelled revolutionary movements for a time, but his policies of reaction had done little to address the fundamental causes of discontent, instead merely suppressing the symptoms. The stage was now set for the final tragic act of the Russian Empire, under a Tsar ill-prepared to confront the gathering storm. From the stern, unyielding reign of Alexander III, we transition to the final tragic chapter of the Russian Empire, presided over by Nicholas II. Imagine a young, deeply religious, and devoted family man thrust onto the throne of a vast, complex, and increasingly volatile empire, utterly unprepared for the monumental challenges that awaited him. Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917, was a man of weak will and limited political acumen, often indecisive, prone to superstition, and deeply committed to preserving the autocratic principles inherited from his father. Despite the clear signs that Russia was rapidly outgrowing such an antiquated system, he famously dismissed the idea of a constitutional monarchy as senseless dreams, clinging to the notion of his divine right to rule, even as the world around him clamored for change. It was as if the empire had an increasingly complex operating system, and the emperor was still running on a medieval dial-up modem, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer demands of the new era. Nicholas's early reign continued the policies of his father, marked by continued Russification, a strengthened Okrana, and a general suppression of liberal and revolutionary movements. However, beneath this veneer of stability, Russia was undergoing profound social and economic transformations that would ultimately undermine the very autocracy Nicholas was so determined to preserve. The most significant of these was rapid industrialization, spurred on by the policies of Finance Minister Sergei Witte. Witte, a visionary economist, championed state-led industrial development, attracting foreign investment, building railroads, including the continued expansion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and promoting heavy industry. Imagine the smokestacks rising across the Russian landscape, the roar of new factories, and the rapid growth of urban centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow. This industrial boom, while impressive in its statistics, came at a heavy social cost. A new, rapidly growing urban working class emerged, toiling in harsh conditions, living in overcrowded slums, and earning meager wages. This environment, ripe for exploitation, became fertile ground for revolutionary agitation, as socialist and communist ideas, imported from Western Europe, found receptive ears among the alienated and downtrodden factory workers. Simultaneously, the peasant question remained largely unresolved. Despite the emancipation, most peasants still suffered from land shortages, high redemption payments, and a backward agricultural system. Periodic famines continued to plague the countryside, and the deep-seated resentment against the landowning nobility and the government simmered. This vast peasant majority, though largely unorganized, represented an enormous potential force for revolution, a slumbering giant that could be awakened by the right spark. Meanwhile, the growing intelligentsia, frustrated by the lack of political freedom and the government's repressive policies, increasingly turned to radical ideologies. Liberal elements sought constitutional reforms and civil liberties, while various socialist parties, including the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which would later split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, gained traction among workers and intellectuals, advocating for a complete overthrow of the autocratic system. The stage was set for a multifaceted challenge to the Tsar's absolute power, coming from different social strata and advocating vastly different solutions. Nicholas II's personal characteristics, unfortunately, made him ill-suited to navigate these turbulent waters. He lacked the political shrewdness of Catherine the Great or the decisive will of Peter the Great. He preferred to delegate authority to incompetent or corrupt ministers, often making decisions based on personal loyalties rather than merit. His strong belief in his divine mission meant he often resisted any advice that suggested a limitation of his autocratic power, even when such limitations might have saved the monarchy. His infamous reliance on the mystical Siberian peasant Grigory Rasputin, particularly after his son and heir, Alexei, was diagnosed with hemophilia, further undermined the prestige and legitimacy of the imperial family. Imagine the whispers and scandal within the court and among the public, as a semi-literate mystic gained unparalleled influence over the Empress Alexandra, and through her, the Tsar himself, making decisions on appointments and policy. This bizarre relationship was a constant source of scandal and deeply damaged the public image of the monarchy, making it seem out of touch and incompetent. The burgeoning internal tensions within Russia were further exacerbated by Nicholas II's ambitious and often miscalculated foreign policy. Driven by a desire for imperial expansion and a belief in Russia's destiny as a great power, he pushed for influence in the Far East, particularly in Korea and Manchuria. This expansionist drive inevitably brought Russia into direct conflict with another rising imperial power, Japan. The stage was set for a military confrontation that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation and would expose, in the most painful way possible, the deep-seated weaknesses of the Russian Empire, setting the stage for the first of many revolutionary tremors that would ultimately bring down the Romanov dynasty. The next major shock to the imperial system was not to come from internal revolution, but from a surprising and humiliating defeat on the world stage. The mounting internal pressures of industrialization, an unresolved peasant question, and a frustrated intelligentsia, all simmering under the ineffective rule of Nicholas II, were about to boil over, not from within, but ignited by a disastrous foreign war. Imagine the sheer disbelief and humiliation that swept through Russia when news began to filter back from the Far East. The mighty Russian Empire, supposedly a great European power, was being decisively defeated by a seemingly minor Asian nation, Japan. This was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, a conflict born out of imperial ambitions colliding in Manchuria and Korea, and it proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation for the Romanov autocracy. For many, it was the definitive proof that the Tsar's government was not only oppressive, but also utterly incompetent. Nicholas II, driven by a desire for a small victorious war to boost national prestige and distract from domestic problems, and underestimating Japan's military capabilities, had pushed for confrontation. His advisors, particularly in the Far East, often encouraged this expansionist policy, seeing it as an easy route to glory. The geographical distances involved were immense. Russia had to transport troops and supplies thousands of miles along the single-track Trans-Siberian Railway, a logistical nightmare that crippled its war effort. Japan, in contrast, was a rapidly modernizing nation with a highly efficient and well-prepared military and naval force. It was a classic David and Goliath story, except this time David had surprisingly modern weaponry and a much better strategy. The war began with a surprise Japanese naval attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in February 1904, a move that crippled the Russian Pacific Squadron and established Japanese naval superiority. This initial blow was followed by a series of humiliating land defeats for Russia, including the Battle of Mukden in February-March 1905, one of the largest land battles in history prior to World War I, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in a brutal, prolonged struggle. The most catastrophic defeat, however, occurred at sea, the Battle of Tsushima Strait in May 1905. Here, the entire Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world for 8 months to reinforce the Pacific Fleet, was virtually annihilated by Admiral Togo Heihachiro's modern Japanese Navy. Imagine the sheer audacity and desperation of sending a fleet on such a monumental journey, only for it to be utterly destroyed in a matter of hours. This naval catastrophe was a profound shock to Russian national pride and a clear demonstration of the empire's military and technological backwardness. Historians still debate whether the decision to send the Baltic fleet on such a futile mission was a testament to imperial stubbornness or simply an act of supreme folly. The news of these repeated humiliating defeats, coupled with the immense human cost and the severe economic strain of the war, ignited widespread public discontent across Russia. The war exacerbated existing grievances: food shortages, rising prices, factory closures, and widespread unemployment. The illusion of the Tsar's infallibility, already chipped away by his perceived weakness and Rasputin's influence, shattered completely. The war became the catalyst that transformed simmering discontent into open rebellion, proving that even a small victorious war could have the exact opposite effect. The war's devastating impact directly triggered the 1905 revolution, beginning with the horrific events of Bloody Sunday on January 22, 1905. On that day, thousands of unarmed workers, led by the Orthodox priest Father Capon, marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar, pleading for better working conditions, civil liberties, and an end to the war. They genuinely believed the Tsar would listen, seeing him as a benevolent father figure who was simply unaware of their suffering. Imagine the scene: a hopeful, if naive crowd, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, approaching the palace gates. However, instead of a sympathetic reception, they were met by Imperial Guard troops who opened fire indiscriminately, killing and wounding hundreds. This unprovoked massacre shattered the centuries-old myth of the benevolent Tsar, forever severing the bond of trust between the monarch and his people. It was a turning point, transforming loyalty into bitter resentment and sparking a wave of protests, strikes, and riots across the empire. The blood spilled on that cold January day stained the reputation of the Romanov dynasty beyond repair. The humiliation of the war and the trauma of Bloody Sunday unleashed a torrent of revolutionary activity. Strikes paralyzed factories and railways, peasant uprisings erupted in the countryside, and even segments of the military mutinied, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. Councils of workers' delegates, known as Soviets, spontaneously emerged in cities like St. Petersburg, demonstrating a nascent form of popular self-organization. Facing an empire on the brink of collapse, Nicholas II, advised by the pragmatic Sergei Witte, was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and conscience, and, most significantly, the creation of a directly elected legislative assembly, the State Duma, without whose consent no law would be passed. The October Manifesto temporarily quelled the revolution by satisfying moderate liberals and dividing the opposition. It seemed, for a brief moment, that Russia was on the path to becoming a constitutional monarchy. However, Nicholas II, still clinging to his autocratic principles, considered the Duma a temporary concession rather than a permanent shift in power. He quickly sought to limit its authority, dissolving the first two Duma when they proved too independent. The fundamental tension between an autocratic ruler and a society increasingly demanding change remained unresolved. The Russo-Japanese War, therefore, was not merely a military defeat. It was the spark that ignited the first full-scale revolution in Russia, exposing the fatal weaknesses of the Tsarist regime and setting a precedent for popular uprising that would ultimately culminate in the empire's final collapse just over a decade later. The cracks that had appeared in the empire's foundation were now gaping fissures, impossible to ignore. The embers of the 1905 revolution, though dampened by the October Manifesto and the creation of the Duma, continued to smolder beneath the surface of Russian society, ready to reignite at the slightest provocation. Imagine a ruler, Nicholas II, who, after being forced to grant limited reforms, immediately set about undermining them, convinced that his divine right to rule was inviolable. This inherent contradiction between the Tsar's autocratic convictions and the growing aspirations of his people meant that the period after 1905 was less a time of genuine constitutionalism and more a volatile dance between limited liberalization and renewed repression. It was a bit like offering someone a tiny sip of water after they've been parched for days, only to immediately snatch the cup away. Following the initial revolutionary fervor, the government, under the guidance of pragmatic ministers like Pyotr Stolypin, attempted to restore order and implement reforms that aimed to stabilize the empire without fundamentally altering the autocratic system. Stolypin, a strong proponent of the monarchy, but also a ruthless pragmatist, believed that Russia needed a period of strong, decisive leadership to avoid collapse. He was like a stern, no-nonsense doctor attempting to cure a very sick patient, using a combination of bitter medicine and careful surgery. His initial focus was on suppressing the remaining revolutionary activity, establishing military field courts that quickly and brutally tried and executed suspected terrorists, a policy so harsh that the gallows became known as Stolypin's necktie. This repression was effective in the short term, driving revolutionary movements further underground. However, Stolypin's vision was not purely repressive. He understood that long-term stability required addressing the root causes of discontent. His most significant and controversial reform was the Stolypin Agrarian Reform, initiated in 1906. This aimed to dissolve the traditional peasant commune, Mar, and create a class of independent, prosperous peasant proprietors, a rural middle class, who would serve as a conservative bulwark against revolution. Peasants were encouraged to consolidate their scattered strips of land into single, privately owned farms, and significant state loans were offered to those willing to move to Siberia and develop new lands. Historians still argue whether these reforms were truly successful. While millions of peasants did consolidate their holdings and move eastward, creating a more productive agricultural sector in some areas, the vast majority of peasants remained trapped in poverty and traditional communal farming. It was a bold attempt to transform the Russian countryside, but it faced immense resistance from deeply ingrained traditions and economic realities. Politically, the Stat Duma, created by the October Manifesto, became a battleground between the Tsar's government and various political factions. Nicholas II, true to his autocratic nature, repeatedly dissolved the first two Duma when they proved too critical or too demanding of constitutional change. In 1907, Stolypin engineered a change to the electoral law, effectively disenfranchising many peasants and workers, and ensuring that future Dumas would be more conservative and more amenable to the government. This was a clear sign that the Tsar saw the Duma not as a truly representative legislative body, but as a consultative assembly that existed at his pleasure. Imagine a game where the rules are constantly changed mid-play to ensure only one side can win. Despite these limitations, the Duma did provide a forum for political debate and criticism, and some moderate parties, like the Octobrists and Cadets, constitutional Democrats, tried to work within the system to push for further reforms. The period between 1907 and 1914 saw a fragile stability, a period of economic growth and relative peace. Russia continued its industrial development, and its military was slowly modernizing. However, the fundamental problems remained unresolved. The vast social inequalities persisted, the peasant question lingered, and the urban working class remained exploited and increasingly radicalized. Nicholas II's continued reliance on figures like Rasputin, whose influence over the imperial family seemed to grow even stronger, continued to erode public trust in the monarchy, generating widespread scandal and outrage among the educated classes and even within the nobility. The whispers and rumors about Rasputin's dark influence became an open secret, a symbol of the monarchy's detachment and vulnerability. While domestic tensions simmered, Russia's foreign policy increasingly focused on the Balkans and its role as the protector of Orthodox Slavs within the crumbling Ottoman Empire. This brought Russia into direct conflict with Austria-Hungary, which had its own ambitions in the region, and indirectly with Germany, Austria-Hungary's powerful ally. The complex web of alliances and rivalries among the European powers was tightening, creating an incredibly dangerous powder keg. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 provided the spark. Russia, bound by its alliance with Serbia and its role as a pan-Slavic protector, mobilized its vast army in response to Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia. This mobilization, in turn, triggered Germany's declaration of war on Russia and then France, engulfing the entire continent in what would become the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. World War I. Nicholas II, with his characteristic blend of weak will and misplaced conviction, led Russia into the war with a genuine belief in its righteousness and a naive hope that it would rally the nation around the throne. He famously stood on the balcony of the Winter Palace, accepting the cheers of the crowd, a seemingly popular act that concealed the deep divisions beneath. However, the Great War would prove to be the ultimate test of the Romanov autocracy, a test it was destined to fail. The immense scale of modern warfare, the sheer brutality of the front lines, and the colossal logistical demands would prove too much for a system already teetering on the brink. The entry into World War would accelerate the empire's downfall, transforming simmering discontent into a full-blown revolutionary inferno that would ultimately consume the very monarchy it was meant to protect. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 initially sparked a wave of patriotic fervor across Russia, momentarily uniting a deeply divided society around the Tsar and the flag. Imagine the scenes in the bustling squares of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Crowds cheering for Nicholas II, soldiers marching off to the front with flowers tucked into their rifle barrels, and the fervent belief that this great war would be short and victorious, cementing Russia's glory and perhaps even resolving its internal woes. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the nationalistic sentiment could indeed overcome the deep-seated grievances that had fueled the 1905 revolution. Nicholas II himself, genuinely believing in Russia's divine mission to protect its Slavic brethren, felt a renewed sense of purpose, hoping the war would redeem his struggling reign. It was a brief, intoxicating period where the immense societal pressures seemed to evaporate in a haze of patriotic delusion. However, this fragile unity quickly disintegrated under the brutal realities of modern warfare. The sheer scale and prolonged nature of World War I were unlike anything Russia had ever faced. The initial Russian offensives into East Prussia, though intended to relieve pressure on France, ended in catastrophic defeats at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in the autumn of 1914. These early losses revealed the deep-seated problems plaguing the Russian military: inadequate training, severe shortages of rifles, ammunition, and artillery, and incompetent leadership. Imagine soldiers being sent to the front with barely a rifle for every 2 men, forced to wait for their comrades to fall before they could pick up a weapon. This was not a small, victorious war. It was a meat grinder on an industrial scale. As the war dragged on, the human cost became astronomical. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, far more than any other combatant nation. The vast and poorly equipped army, often led by aristocratic generals with little modern military experience, suffered one devastating defeat after another on the Eastern Front. The Russian heartland, though far from the fighting, was crippled by the war's economic demands. Food and fuel shortages became endemic in the cities, leading to skyrocketing prices and widespread hunger. Factories struggled to maintain production. Transportation networks buckled under the strain of military logistics, and inflation soared, rapidly eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. While the war effort devoured resources, the common people starved and froze, fueling a growing sense of desperation and resentment. The Tsar's personal leadership during the war proved to be another critical blow to the monarchy's legitimacy. In 1915, Nicholas II made the fateful decision to take personal command of the Russian army at the front, leaving the governance of the empire to his wife, Empress Alexandra, and her increasingly influential confidant, Grigory Rasputin. Historians still argue whether this decision was a patriotic act or a profound error in judgment. It certainly placed the blame for all military failures squarely on the Tsar's shoulders, while his absence from the capital left a power vacuum that was disastrously filled. Alexandra, a strong-willed, but deeply unpopular empress of German descent, was widely mistrusted and believed to be under the complete sway of Rasputin. Imagine the whispers that spread through society. A foreign-born empress under the spell of a Siberian mystic, making crucial decisions that affected the lives of millions. This bizarre and scandalous influence of Rasputin, already a source of deep concern, reached its peak during the war, as his interference in government appointments and his scandalous behavior further eroded public confidence in the monarchy. Even conservative monarchists and members of the royal family pleaded with the Tsar to remove him. But Nicholas, driven by his wife's devotion and his own faith in the holy man's ability to help his hemophiliac son Alexei, remained deaf to their warnings. The situation became so dire that, in December 1916, a group of high-ranking aristocrats and politicians, including Prince Felix Yusupov, assassinated Rasputin, hoping his removal would save the monarchy. Imagine the desperate, almost amateurish nature of the plot, involving poison, shooting, and finally drowning. A dramatic final act for a figure who had so tragically undermined the credibility of the Romanovs. However, Rasputin's death came too late. The damage to the monarchy's reputation was irreparable, and his removal did nothing to stem the tide of discontent. The political system was collapsing, as ministers were appointed and dismissed with bewildering frequency, creating an atmosphere of chronic instability and demonstrating the utter dysfunction at the top. By early 1917, Russia was a nation teetering on the brink. The war, which was meant to unify, had instead exposed and exacerbated every existing social, economic, and political fault line. The cities were gripped by hunger and cold. The army was demoralized and mutinous. And the Tsar had lost the faith of virtually every segment of society, from the liberal Duma politicians to the conservative nobility, and the increasingly radicalized workers and peasants. The long-suffering Russian people, after years of war, sacrifice, and the perceived incompetence of their rulers, were finally reaching their breaking point. The stage was set for the final decisive act of the Russian Revolution, a rapid and unexpected collapse that would end centuries of autocratic rule and reshape the course of the 20th century. The Great War had not only brought Russia to its knees, but had also ignited the revolutionary flames that would consume the very empire it was fighting to defend. From the crucible of World War I, where Russia bled profusely on the Eastern Front, the empire finally reached its breaking point, culminating in the swift and largely unexpected February Revolution of 1917. Imagine the scene in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to sound less German during the war. Freezing temperatures, bread lines stretching for blocks, desperate women and children shivering in the snow, and the ever-present rumor of impending famine. The war had utterly crippled the home front, transforming a simmering cauldron of discontent into a raging inferno. For months, strikes had been mounting, not just for better wages, but for bread and peace. A simple but powerful cry that encapsulated the profound suffering of the working class and the peasantry. The immediate spark came on International Women's Day, February 23rd, March 8th, by the Gregorian calendar, when thousands of female textile workers in Petrograd went on strike, demanding bread. Their protest quickly swelled, drawing in other factory workers and disaffected citizens. Imagine the police and Cossack patrols, usually ruthless in suppressing dissent, finding themselves hesitant to fire on crowds largely composed of women and children. This initial hesitation was a critical deviation from previous crackdowns, signaling a profound shift in the loyalty of the armed forces. As the days progressed, the strikes escalated into a general strike, paralyzing the capital. Public transport ceased, shops closed, and the streets filled with protesters demanding an end to the war and the autocratic regime. The sheer scale and spontaneity of the uprising caught everyone by surprise, from the Tsar to the various revolutionary parties. Nicholas II, far away at army headquarters in Mogilev, remained tragically out of touch with the gravity of the situation. He dismissed reports of unrest as mere hooliganism and ordered his troops to suppress the protests with force. This was a fatal miscalculation, echoing the disastrous Bloody Sunday of 1905. But this time, the outcome would be different. On February 27th, critical regiments of the Petrograd garrison, many of whom were raw recruits or veterans, disillusioned by the war, began to mutiny. Instead of firing on the protesters, they joined them, turning their rifles on their officers and opening the gates of prisons. Imagine the shock and jubilation as soldiers, the supposed guarantors of imperial authority, sided with the people. This wholesale defection of the military transformed a protest into a revolution, signaling the complete collapse of the Tsar's authority in the capital. With the military defecting and the streets in chaos, two rival centers of power rapidly emerged in Petrograd: the Provisional Committee of the State Duma and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. The Duma, which Nicholas II had contemptuously dissolved just days earlier, formed a provisional committee of liberal politicians, recognizing the need to restore order and establish a new government. At the same time, revolutionary workers and mutinous soldiers, remembering the Soviets of 1905, spontaneously reformed the Petrograd Soviet, a grassroots council representing the will of the revolutionary masses. This dual power structure, a kind of uneasy truce between the liberal bourgeoisie and the radical workers and soldiers, would define the political landscape of Russia for the next 8 months. It was a peculiar arrangement, like two opposing teams suddenly forced to share a single, unstable lifeboat. Faced with the complete collapse of authority in the capital, mutinies in the army, and appeals from his generals and even some members of his own family, Nicholas II finally recognized the inevitable. On March Day 1917, March 15th by the Gregorian calendar, on a railway car in Pskov, he reluctantly signed his abdication. He initially tried to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexei, but medical advice about Alexei's hemophilia led him to abdicate for himself and his son in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. However, Michael, fearing for his life and recognizing the popular rejection of monarchy, wisely declined the throne, stating he would only accept if offered by a truly representative constituent assembly. Imagine the final bitter stroke of the pen, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. A quiet signing in a train carriage. The end of the Romanov dynasty, after over 300 years, was remarkably swift and bloodless in its initial stages. The February Revolution was largely a spontaneous uprising driven by hunger, war weariness, and a complete loss of faith in the autocratic government. It was hailed by liberals and socialists alike as a triumph of popular will, a glorious, almost joyful liberation from centuries of oppression. The streets of Petrograd, once filled with protesters, now celebrated with parades and speeches, showcasing a newfound sense of freedom and hope. The provisional government, formed by the Duma liberals and led first by Prince Georgy Lvov and later by the eloquent socialist revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, immediately declared civil liberties, dissolved the Okhrana, and promised elections for a constituent assembly that would determine Russia's future form of government. It truly seemed like a new dawn for Russia, a transition from autocracy to democracy. However, the provisional government faced immense challenges from the outset. It inherited a country still embroiled in a disastrous war, an economy in shambles, and a populace with sky-high expectations for immediate and radical change, particularly regarding land redistribution and an end to the war. Critically, the provisional government insisted on continuing Russia's participation in World War I, believing it was honor-bound to its allies, and that a revolutionary Russia could not abandon the struggle against German militarism. This decision, however, proved to be its fatal flaw, alienating the war-weary soldiers, workers, and peasants who desired peace above all else. The dual power structure also created constant friction, with the Petrograd Soviet often challenging the authority of the provisional government. The euphoria of February quickly faded as the new government struggled to deliver on its promises, leaving the door open for more radical forces to seize the initiative. The euphoria of the February Revolution, which had so swiftly toppled the Romanov dynasty, quickly gave way to a period of deepening crisis for the provisional government. Imagine a fragile new administration, born out of popular uprising, trying to steer a colossal wounded ship through a maelstrom, while simultaneously debating its destination with a fractious crew. The dual power structure, where the provisional government theoretically held state authority, but the Petrograd Soviet commanded the loyalty of the workers and soldiers, created a paralyzing paralysis. It was like having two captains on one ship, each shouting different orders, ensuring nothing truly got done. This fundamental instability, coupled with the immense, unaddressed grievances of the populace, created a vacuum into which increasingly radical forces would inevitably step. The most critical mistake of the provisional government, and the one that sealed its fate, was its unwavering commitment to continuing Russia's participation in World War I, led first by Prince Lvov and then by the eloquent but ultimately ineffective Alexander Kerensky. The government believed it was their national duty to honor alliances and fight against German militarism. However, the vast majority of Russian soldiers, workers, and peasants were utterly exhausted by the war. They yearned for peace, land, and bread. Simple demands that the provisional government, beholden to its Western allies and fearful of social upheaval, simply could not deliver. Offensive after offensive launched by the provisional government, often against the advice of military leaders and with flagging morale, led to further catastrophic losses and mass desertions. Imagine entire regiments simply abandoning the front lines, their will to fight utterly broken, wanting only to return home to their families and their land. This continued bleeding on the battlefield drained the last vestiges of popular support for the government. As the provisional government faltered, struggling with an escalating economic crisis and a disintegrating army, the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist faction led by the utterly brilliant and ruthless Vladimir Lenin, rapidly gained influence. Lenin, who had been in exile in Switzerland, famously returned to Russia in April 1917, facilitated by the German government, which hoped he would further destabilize Russia. Upon his arrival, he immediately issued his April Theses, a clear and uncompromising call for all power to the Soviets, an end to the war, nationalization of land, and a transition from a bourgeois to a socialist revolution. This provided a concise, powerful, and understandable platform that resonated deeply with the masses, a stark contrast to the provisional government's vague promises and continued war effort. While other socialist parties dithered and debated, Lenin offered a clear, actionable plan. It was like watching a well-oiled political machine go up against a hesitant, committee-driven bureaucracy. The summer of 1917 saw a series of crises that further undermined the provisional government. The disastrous June offensive on the Eastern Front, intended to be a decisive victory, instead resulted in massive casualties and widespread demoralization. In July, the July Days saw spontaneous armed demonstrations by workers and soldiers in Petrograd, fueled by rumors of an imminent Bolshevik uprising. Though these protests were suppressed by the government, and Lenin was forced into hiding, it demonstrated the growing volatility of the capital and the increasing appeal of radical solutions. Kerensky, now Prime Minister, struggled to maintain control, caught between the demands of the left and the pressure from conservative military leaders. The final nail in the coffin for the provisional government came with the Kornilov affair in August 1917. General Lava Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, a conservative who believed that only military force could restore order, attempted a coup to crush the Petrograd Soviet and establish a military dictatorship. In a desperate move, Kerensky turned to the Bolsheviks and their armed Red Guards for assistance in defending Petrograd from Kornilov's forces. The Bolsheviks, portraying themselves as the defenders of the revolution against counter-revolution, successfully organized resistance, distributing arms to their supporters and rallying the workers. The coup ultimately failed due to widespread opposition and the mutiny of Kornilov's own troops. However, the affair profoundly strengthened the Bolsheviks, legitimizing their armed forces and demonstrating their organizational capabilities, while simultaneously discrediting Kerensky and exposing the provisional government's fundamental weakness and reliance on its radical opponents. It was a bizarre, almost self-inflicted wound, where the provisional government inadvertently armed its future destroyers. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government had lost all effective control. The army was disintegrating, peasants were seizing land across the countryside, and workers were taking over factories. The Bolsheviks, under the brilliant organizational leadership of Leon Trotsky, who had become chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, had gained majorities in the key Soviets of Petrograd and Moscow. Their message of peace, land, and bread resonated powerfully with a population utterly exhausted by war and economic hardship. They also skillfully used propaganda, promising a new world order where the power belonged to the workers and peasants, a stark contrast to the perceived failures of the liberal government. They didn't need to create the conditions for revolution. The provisional government, in its inability to address the core problems, had done that for them. The stage was now set for the final act of the 1917 revolutions, a meticulously planned and swiftly executed seizure of power that would bring the curtain down on the provisional government and usher in an entirely new and utterly brutal chapter in Russian history. From the chaos and paralysis of the provisional government, the stage was now meticulously set for the final decisive act of the 1917 revolutions, the October Revolution. Imagine a seemingly normal autumn night in Petrograd, just weeks after the failed Kornilov coup. But beneath the surface, a clandestine force, organized with ruthless efficiency, was preparing to seize the reins of a collapsing state. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising like February. This was a calculated, strategically executed takeover by the Bolsheviks, a small but disciplined party led by the unyielding will of Vladimir Lenin and the brilliant organizational skills of Leon Trotsky. The provisional government under Alexander Kerensky was by this point utterly adrift, having alienated nearly every segment of society. Its continued prosecution of World War I was met with mass desertions and widespread mutinies. Its failure to address the crucial issues of land reform and food shortages meant that peasant unrest and urban starvation continued unabated. The dual power structure had crippled its ability to govern effectively, as the Petrograd Soviet, increasingly dominated by Bolsheviks, constantly challenged its authority. Kerensky himself, exhausted and isolated, reportedly spent his final days as premier desperately trying to rally support. A tragic figure presiding over a government that had lost all legitimacy. It was like watching a slow-motion shipwreck, where everyone could see the disaster unfolding, but no one seemed capable of preventing it. Lenin, meanwhile, had returned from hiding in Finland in early October, absolutely convinced that the time was ripe for an armed uprising. He argued passionately, often against the initial skepticism of his own party comrades, that the provisional government was on the verge of collapse, and that the Bolsheviks, by seizing power in the name of the Soviets, could fulfill the popular demands for peace, land, and bread. His famous slogan, "All power to the Soviets," resonated deeply, offering a clear, radical alternative to the perceived inaction and incompetence of the existing government. Historians still debate whether Lenin truly represented the will of the masses, or whether his vision was a calculated imposition by a vanguard party on a chaotic situation. Regardless, his iron will and strategic foresight were undeniable. The execution of the coup was masterminded by Leon Trotsky, who, as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, used his position to control the Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, the Soviets' armed wing. The MRC, largely comprised of loyal Bolshevik Red Guards and sympathetic military units from the Petrograd garrison and the Kronstadt sailors, systematically took control of key strategic points in the capital. Picture this meticulously planned operation. On the night of October 24th, 25, 1917, November 6th to 7th by the Gregorian calendar. While most of Petrograd slept, small disciplined units moved silently. They seized railway stations, post offices, bridges, power stations, and the state bank, facing little to no resistance. It was an astonishingly bloodless coup, less a popular uprising and more a swift, decisive military takeover of vital infrastructure. The provisional government, with virtually no loyal troops left to defend it, was powerless to resist. The symbolic climax of the October Revolution came on the night of October 25th, with the storming of the Winter Palace, the last bastion of the provisional government. While often romanticized in Soviet propaganda as a heroic mass assault, the reality was far less dramatic. It was largely a disorganized affair, with little actual fighting. Members of the provisional government were arrested in the early hours of October 26th. Kerensky himself had already fled the capital, attempting to gather loyal troops, an ultimately futile effort. Imagine the final, desperate meeting of ministers in the vast empty halls of the Winter Palace, awaiting their inevitable capture, the last remnants of a dream of democratic Russia. On the same day as news of the provisional government's overthrow spread, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convened. With the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, walking out in protest, the Bolsheviks, along with their left SR allies, declared that power had passed to the Soviets. Lenin, appearing at the Congress, triumphantly announced the formation of the new Soviet government, the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, with himself as its chairman. He immediately issued the decree on peace, calling for an end to the war without annexations or indemnities, and the decree on land, which formally nationalized all land and ordered its redistribution to the peasants, legitimizing the spontaneous land seizures already occurring across the countryside. These decrees, simple, direct, and addressing the most pressing needs of the war-weary and hungry population, instantly cemented Bolshevik popularity, even if their long-term implications were far more complex. The October Revolution marked the end of the brief, chaotic experiment with liberal democracy in Russia, and the definitive end of the provisional government. It was, in essence, the coup de grace for the Russian Empire, even though the formal declaration of the Soviet Union would come later. The centuries-old system of monarchy had been definitively replaced not by a democratic republic, but by a new, revolutionary, and ultimately totalitarian political order. The empire, having struggled for centuries with reform and repression, had finally collapsed under the weight of war and internal contradictions. The stage was now set for the incredibly bloody and devastating civil war that would follow, as the Bolsheviks fought to consolidate their power against a vast array of internal and external enemies, firmly establishing the Soviet state upon the ashes of the old empire. The story of the Russian Empire, in its traditional sense, had reached its violent, conclusive end. The echo of the rifle, shot from the Winter Palace, though largely symbolic, truly marked the final, definitive end of the Russian Empire, even as the new Bolshevik government began its tumultuous struggle for survival. Imagine the world after October 1917, a vast, sprawling land, no longer ruled by Tsars, but by a radical communist party. The immediate aftermath of the October Revolution was not the peaceful utopia promised by the Bolsheviks, but rather the beginning of a brutal and protracted Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. This was the final agonizing death throe of the old order and the violent birth of a completely new one. It was a fight for the soul of Russia, pitting the Bolshevik Reds against a disparate array of whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, and various anti-Bolshevik socialist factions, often supported by foreign interventionist forces from Britain, France, the US, and Japan, who feared the spread of communism. This conflict plunged Russia into an even deeper abyss of suffering than the World War, a brutal fratricidal struggle where millions perished from combat, famine, and disease. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's uncompromising leadership and Trotsky's brilliant military organization, moved swiftly to consolidate their power. They established the Cheka, a ruthless secret police force which employed widespread terror, including mass arrests and executions, to suppress all opposition. This policy of Red Terror was a brutal but effective tool in crushing dissent and eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. They also signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, a humiliating but necessary peace treaty that ceded vast territories and resources to the Central Powers, but crucially allowed the Bolsheviks to focus their limited resources on winning the Civil War. Imagine the cries of betrayal from those who saw this as a national humiliation, a sacrifice of Russian land for the sake of an ideology. However, Lenin famously argued that peace, no matter how harsh, was essential for the survival of the revolution. The former imperial family, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their 5 children, who had been held under house arrest since the February Revolution, met a tragic and brutal end during this period. In July 1918, as white forces approached Ekaterinburg, where they were imprisoned, the entire family, along with their doctor and servants, were executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house by Bolshevik guards. This chilling act was a definitive severing of all ties to the monarchical past, ensuring that no pretender could ever rally support around the Romanov name again. Historians still argue whether the order came directly from Lenin himself or was a local initiative, but the brutal efficiency of the execution left no doubt as to the Bolsheviks' resolve. It was a grim, symbolic closure to the centuries-long reign of the Tsars. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the Bolsheviks ultimately triumphed in the Civil War due to several key factors. They controlled the central industrial and population heartland of Russia, giving them a logistical advantage. Their centralized command structure and unified purpose contrasted sharply with the disunity, conflicting goals, and poor coordination among the various white armies. Trotsky's creation of the highly disciplined Red Army, utilizing former Tsarist officers under political commissars and imposing harsh discipline, proved immensely effective. Furthermore, the Bolsheviks successfully appealed to the peasantry by legitimizing their land seizures and promising an end to the war, securing a degree of popular support that the whites, often associated with a return to the old order, could not match. The foreign intervention, rather than weakening the Bolsheviks, often served to rally nationalist sentiment against the invaders, playing directly into the Bolshevik narrative of defending Russia against foreign and counter-revolutionary forces. By 1922, the last significant white forces had been defeated, and the foreign interventions had largely ceased. The Russian Civil War concluded with the Bolsheviks firmly in control of the vast majority of the former Russian Empire's territory. This victory, however, came at an unimaginable cost. Millions dead from fighting, famine, exacerbated by war communism policies, and disease, a shattered economy, and a society traumatized by years of continuous warfare. The end of the Civil War marked the final irreversible transition from the Russian Empire to a new political entity. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was officially formed, a declaration that formally enshrined the new communist state built on the ruins of the Russian Empire. This wasn't just a change in name. It represented a fundamental ideological shift from a hereditary monarchy based on divine right to a one-party, nominally socialist state based on Marxist-Leninist principles. The empire, with its Tsars, nobility, and centuries of tradition, was officially consigned to the history books, replaced by a system that promised a worker's paradise, but would, in practice, become one of the most totalitarian regimes in human history. The legacy of the Russian Empire, its vastness, its multi-ethnic composition, its ingrained autocratic tendencies, and its complex relationship with both East and West, would continue to shape the new Soviet state in profound ways. But the story of Tsarist Russia, that long, often brutal, but undeniably grand narrative, had finally come to an end, closing the book on an era of emperors, serfs, and imperial ambitions, and opening another, equally dramatic, chapter in the vast Eurasian land. So, as the last echoes of the Winter Palace's fall fade into the annals of history, and the long, complex tapestry of the Russian Empire unfurls its final threads, you can truly appreciate the journey we've taken together. From the earliest whispers of Slavic tribes in the misty forests, through the grand consolidation of Muscovy, the audacious westernizing of Peter the Great, the enlightened yet contradictory rule of Catherine, the chilling repression of Nicholas I, and finally, the slow, agonizing demise under Nicholas II. This empire was a crucible of power, art, and profound human suffering. Its story is one of immense ambition, relentless expansion, and a persistent struggle between the desire for progress and the deep-seated resistance to change. The echoes of its triumphs and tragedies still resonate in the world today, reminding us how deeply the past shapes the present. As the sun sets on this grand narrative, take comfort in knowing that even the mightiest empires eventually yield to the ceaseless march of time, leaving behind only the lessons, the mysteries, and the quiet satisfaction of a story well told.